Hi, Roberta. How are you? You gotta unmute yourself. Hi, Roberta.
Hello, how are you?
Good. How are you? Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank
They
you.
should be
Nice to meet you.
to meet you as well. Yeah. So we one of the exciting ones we have on the Greek art, #2. I hope you saw our first one on YouTube channel.
I didn't, but I can maybe go back and check that out.
Oh, I mean, yeah, maybe later. But we have a guy presenting who actually has his bachelor's in ancient history, and Paul. And I've had this group since January. We used to meet in person, and then we took it online in Zoom, and it just took off. You know, we used to just meet once a month. Now we meet 3-4 times a week.
Oh, really? It's
On
so much
Zoom.
easier for everyone.
Yeah, it's on Zoom, and we used to just go get drinks and talk history. And now we expanded. You know, we started with ancient history. Now we have, I don't know if you have a schedule. You see my schedule. So the schedule.
That's what I'm looking at then. Okay.
Yeah. So the first part of the schedule is anything. We go through timeline. We start with Mesopotamia. Now we're in ancient Greece. And then, basically we're going to make our way to Rome, and we're skipping Egypt for now, but we'll get to Egypt at some point. The second part is basically anything, any history topics outside of ancient timeline that we're going through. We're doing is, state, Zionist and state of Israel. It's actually a second topic we're doing. Then we'll do a nuclear race, USA versus USSR, the Bushido Code of Japan, Hanseatic League, which is interesting, cultural Cold War, conquest of Americas. So it's different type of topics. Then we have a third block. We have ancient text. We actually read a book like we have on the 23rd, something like a Josephus Flavius, Jewish Wars. We read a book before it, and then we discuss the text. So the presenter puts up main points, and we discuss main points of the book and what it was about. I mean, it's still a history type of discussion, but mostly also has to do with texts. Then we also have invitational, like scholars. Jonathan is actually opera singer and reincarnator of Roman legionnaires, and he also knows a lot about Teutonic Knights and medieval time. So he does a lot of, so you wanted to do something on English under the King John, who was actually a brother of Richard the Lionheart. Then we have a fifth segment, which is we just discuss personalities or interesting aspects of the things. So for example, we're going to talk about, he's not an interesting personality, but he's definitely ruthless. Idi Amin of Uganda, Then we'll have Rommel, who was, a general, Hitler's general. Then we have Arab Spring, we're going to talk about different aspects of that. And then we'll have somebody present Napoleon. But you have the timelines, so it's like a month apart.
Hi, Zach, it's Ava.
Ava, how are you?
Good. Zach, I was thinking if you could have been anybody back in the Roman and Greek era, what would you have been?
Oh, man. Hard to say. I don't know if I fit any mold particularly, but something within like organizer, probably a good organizer, not necessarily a good general or
A
anything else.
senator, maybe?
Yeah, like exactly. I mean, some red tape, bureaucratic, Roman, maybe like, hopefully not Pontius Pilate, but maybe Pontius Pilate.
John here, I think it's best to stay out of politics in Rome. It's better to be a senator in some province far away.
Yes.
That's exactly. I need some cushy, because
Yes.
So
And
Zach,
cushy
here's
villa.
another interesting little tidbit. We had an ornithologist on the other day and talking about the decline of the passenger pigeon. And I said to him, what is the first known bird? And he said, that's a hard one. And then somebody said, Gilgamesh, the raven.
Oh, wow.
Have you ever thought of, well, I guess that's off topic, but the birds ever known in mankind?
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's I'm only focused on history right now. Sorry, John. By the way, I'm sorry. I moved Fall of Sparta to the 9th. If that's okay with you.
That sounds good.
Yeah, and
Enough space.
and I know I'm not replacing you. She told me to move it because it was right after the Christmas day. But I'm gonna do a tour of Istanbul. I was in Istanbul last year, archaeological museum, and I want to do something like that.
That
because
sounds
people,
really good.
yeah, people don't get to travel. So what I
No.
want to do is anywhere that I went, like Hermitage, Istanbul type of stuff. So
Yeah, especially now, that'd be really good. Except I think Turkey is one of the few countries that is accepting Americans right now.
oh really?
I remember reading, yeah.
Hey Paul.
Yeah, how that
are you?
whole air travel is going to be restored is how air travel is going to be restored is a big mystery to me. So
Yeah.
it could take a while.
Hey Paul, how are
To
you?
have virtual tour.
I'm good. Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Good morning.
Yes, hi, Paul.
I figure I use a couple of minutes before we start and just go through schedule a little bit, if you
Sure.
think okay, so it's okay. And then so again, let's just start from the beginning. I know we only have 9 people, but so I changed some things on the schedule. Oh God, 1 second. I changed some things on the schedule, and so today we have a Greek art, part 2, classical period discussion. Then what I did is I switched the Fall of Sparta from the 1226 to 19 because it's a day after Christmas, and how many people will show up? I want to do something like a tour of different museums. Last year I was in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, so I wanted to do the tour of that with pictures and, not necessarily would be in that tour, but we'll go through different sections, and whatever I can explain, I will explain. Whatever I can, we'll just move on. And it's also really fitting the Greek scenery type of thing because there's a lot of Greek artifacts in that museum. So that's the first section. People can see first section, and we have Fall of Sparta, Philip by Greg, Alexander, John Aaron, Diadochi, and so forth, so on. On the our non-history days, on Sundays, we have on Sunday we have Zionist and State of Israel by Rich, Nuclear Race by Aaron 1-3, and I'll talk to Hadrian. I'm not sure if Hadrian hasn't visited any of recent ones, so he's doing Bushido code, and then Aaron's going to do Hanseatic League. On the ancient text, I switched, and I mean, it was my fault. I didn't do Josephus Flavius last time, but I switched with Paul. I'm going to do Josephus Flavius on the 23rd, and Paul will do Xenophon Anabasis on 127 because it's just too close.
Thank you very much, Zach.
Yeah, so I did that, and then Paul will do Homer somewhere in February. So it's a month apart. On next week, Wednesday, we have Jonathan, who did an amazing job on the Teutonic Knights, and he's going to do King John. 1200, 1216. On the 1230, I'm doing Idi Amin. I know I have 3 presentations. This, hopefully, by miracle, I'll do a good job for all 3. Then Rommel, I still need a presenter. I mean, if anybody wants to take Rommel, I don't need anything elaborate. It's a discussion point type of thing. If anybody wants to take it, let me know. If not, I'll do it. Arab Spring, I think Rich and Aaron wanted to do something on Arab Spring. I mean, we can do Assad. I mean, since we're doing personalities and it's a live podcast, we can kind of do Assad, but we'll see. And somebody suggested maybe doing Napoleon somewhere in March. If anybody wants to present that, let me know. And then the history of things. I will actually do next Thursday, Tesla, Neo, Xpeng, and Li, future of electronic vehicle. We all know, China is trying to expand their market by 2025. They want to have 25% of their market to be EVs. Then Sergio will do history of beer. And then I need somebody to do history of ancient weapons, bow and arrow and armor. We'll
Gotta be Sergio too, right?
I don't know. We'll see.
Sergio
is on the West Coast right now. He's chilling in Hawaii.
Oh,
Yeah. And then I know Paul had exhibited an interest in doing the history of mining and metallurgy. I think that fits right in there. We'll see.
specifically, not the whole history, but just the history of mining and metallurgy in the classical world.
Classical world, correct. So that's that. Without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing, and then Paul will share his.
Okay.
We have 15 people on. Hi, everybody. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Louisa. Why don't you say hi? Beverly, Obule, Jane.
Can people let me know if they can see the screen?
We did.
Yes.
We do.
Yes, we see
Right,
it.
right and clear.
Yes.
No problem. Hi, Zach. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Okay, and this, very good. Okay, so let's get started. So this is part 2 of the presentation that I did a few months ago, at which I managed to get up to kind of like the late Archaic period, the 520s BC. So my plan for today is to focus on the transition from the late Archaic period to the Classical period, and hopefully take us down to the middle of the High Classical period around 450. Not a whole lot of years, but there's an awful lot of things happening. So I don't want to go faster than that. And I'm going to divide the presentation basically into 2 parts. One part being around vase painting, and the second around sculpture. And let me say for the introduction, that first of all, I invite people to make comments at any time during the presentation. Don't raise your hand, don't wait for the end. Say when you speak, when you have something on your mind. And because it's fruitful to have discussions during the presentation, I like that. And secondly, just to remind everybody that I'm a history buff. I'm not a professional historian. Certainly not an art historian. I have no degree. This is just something that I love and I've studied, and I just want to share that. So that said, let me say that the main sources, as in the previous lecture, the first is undergraduate course that I took in 2017 with Professor Yanis Malinopoulos, who's a classical archaeologist at Columbia, very knowledgeable man, terrific. teacher and learned a lot from him, enjoyed his classes. And Robin Osborne, who wrote this book. And Osborne is interesting because he is a kind of a, what you would call a traditional historian, and where the art historical point of view tends to talk about developments in art kind of in itself, and to avoid making historical parallels with other things that are going on at the same time. That's exactly what Osborne tries to take on. So I basically rely on him a lot for his interpretations of the relationship between historical events and the art. So we really have to start by mentioning Sir John Beasley. Sir John Beasley essentially invented the modern field of study of vase painting. He worked in this for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. He used techniques that were devised by Giovanni Morelli, who's a 19th century Italian art historian. And Morelli identified the hand of artists through close scrutiny of tiny stylistic details. For example, the way the artist draws fingers or the folds of the ear. And Beasley adopted this method to study Greek vase painting and to identify artists, which is particularly important here because they're usually unsigned, the works, and they're frequently fragments, survivals of black and red figure art. So the attribution to artists, and he really attributed thousands, if not tens of thousands of vases to artists based on, he replaced previously, it was done by broad aspects of subject and style, and it failed to recognize the work of subordinate painters in the same workshop and later Roman copies. And now when you read much more recent scholarship on this, they all refer to Beasley. In fact, in many cases, they feel much more comfortable arguing with each other when it's around something that Beasley himself was unsure of. So it's really impossible to overestimate his contribution. So, oh, I'm sorry, I went to page end instead of page down. So there's people, sometimes it's confusing to understand how the pots are actually named. There's a broad variety of different types of names. So very briefly, the best way to identify a pot painter is if he actually signed his work. And some of them did, Sophilos, Ezekias, Nearchos, and others. But they are the minority. Basically, the way that Greek pots are signed is it says in Greek, so-and-so made me, so-and-so painted me. Sometimes so-and-so made me and painted me, the pot being the speaker. So if it's either signed by the painter as painter and maker or just as painter, that's number one. Number two, if it's signed by the potter but not by the painter, then we'll identify the painter by the potter's name. So the potter Andokidis, the painter who painted his pots is identified as the Andokidis painter. Failing that, then what they'll do is they'll find a vase which has a very a very conspicuous main work, and they call that the name vase, the name vase. So the Achilles painter is most famous for a vase which depicts Achilles, the Gorgon painter, and so on. Sometimes they will identify a painter by the primary museum where his work is exhibited. Sometimes they will identify a painter by the archaeological context where his work was discovered. So the Dipolon painter is referred to the fact that his works were discovered in the Dipylon Cemetery of Athens. And then mostly for lesser painters, though, sometimes they identify them by a museum and an inventory number. And it's just kind of just a way of making a very unambiguous way of identifying where it is. So I'm going to start with a brief review of where we were, so we're not just picking up in the middle. So I'm going to give a quick summary, and then as I do the summary, I'm going to give a somewhat deeper look into some issues that I skipped in the previous presentation. So my starting point was the Bronze Age collapse, which was a tremendously traumatic experience for the Greeks. There was tremendous depopulation. Their system of centralized administration disappeared. Agriculture greatly disappeared, and some scholars even say that it was lost. Writing was lost for 300 years, creating what was called the Dark Age, because there's no writing, so it's dark. And for our purposes here, figurative art was completely lost. That started to come back after 250 years. Well, art started to come back after 250 years with the beginning of the geometric phase in about 900 BCE. There's this period, as I said, there's complete darkness regarding written texts and very extreme scarcity regarding other material remains. But we start to see the emergence of this geometric style of pot decoration in the early 900s. And the decoration gets progressively more elaborate through the 9th century, but it's still restricted to abstract images. When we get to the late geometric period, which is the 8th century, we start to see something new. And what that is the rediscovery of figurative representation. Initially, this is restricted to animals, as in the Euboean pot on the left, where the animals are painted in decorative bands, taking the place of the rosettes and swastikas, characteristic of the Middle Geometric. Athens, however, shows conspicuous ambition by moving to representations of the human form. So looking at these two pots in detail, on the Athenian vase, we see part of the funeral ritual, and it's particularly appropriate because both of these vases were used as funerary markers. They were found in cemeteries. They're both huge, by the way, 5 or 6 feet tall, and were the grave markers. So the Athenian vase actually depicts the sequence of events that leads to the pot being deposited at the vase, the pot being deposited at the grave. And the scene that we're looking at here is called the prothesis. And the prothesis is the laying out of the body. And you see mourners on either side. And the prothesis would be followed by something called the ekphora, which is the procession to the grave, which is also depicted on the vase. So we see that the Athenian vase speaks much more directly to the viewer about the reason for why it's there and what it represents with greater intensity and psychological involvement. At the same time, we need to note that this is not narrative. It does not tell a specific story. It's a generic scene. So we should think of it as a tableau. But at the same time, we see important hallmarks of developments that will be carried over later into black figure technique, which is that we see bodies in silhouette with triangular frontal facing torsos and heads in profile. The next major step forward was the black figure technique, which was invented in Corinth around the beginning of the 7th century. If we have time at the end and people are interested, I'll go into more detail how this works, but I did go into it in detail in the last discussion, so I will only just summarize it here by saying that the areas that are designed to be painted, that are designed to come out black, are painted with a very purified clay called slip. And the details are incised through the slip with a stylus, which I kind of imagine being kind of like a dental tool, you know, a thing with a little point on the end. And then there's this very ingenious 3-stage firing technique based on trial and error, which was discovery of some basic chemical properties of the way clay reacts with high heat in the presence or absence of oxygen. And that brings out the contrasting lines that were etched into the clay. Now the black figure technique quickly made its way to Athens, but at first the Athenian painters who did this just copied the mode of that the Corinthians used, which is basically to depict animals. But this was done with very high artistic quality in this vase, which is attributed by Beasley to Sophilos. But very soon after this, we see the Athenians moving to use their techniques to tell specific narratives from heroic myth. So on the left is the name vase of the Polyphemus painter. Polyphemus is the name of the Cyclops in the Odyssey, who eats 8 or 9 of Odysseus's crew until they blind him in his one eye, which is the scene that's depicted on this vase. And on the right, we see the scene of Hercules, Heracles in Greek, killing the centaur Nessus that tried to basically abduct his new wife. On the left, there's only slight examples of black figure, which is the etching for the fingers and toes and the headbands of the members of Ulysses' crew, Odysseus' crew. We do see the torso in black silhouette and a lighter outline for the most important character, which is Odysseus, which is standard geometric techniques. By time we get to the Nessus Painter, which is maybe a generation later, we're really seeing pure black figure technique, real black figure. And we notice another new milestone, which is on the Nessus vase, that the characters are identified by name. And so what we call the artists of this period, but we must recall that the vase painters were never considered artists in the ancient world. There are lots of surviving texts in the ancient world about the great artists, and they never mention a single vase painter. They talk about sculptors, they talk about painters of large wall frescoes. So the vase painters, though clearly they're, at least in the view of many people, me among them, clearly rise to the level of artists, they were really kind of craftsmen and much more subject to the desires of their audience, their customer base, if you will.
Paul, John?
Sure.
Can I ask you a question? There are so many vases all over, museums. If they were not considered super art at that time, and I don't know, later on, how do all the Europeans that they went to Greece and they took all these vases, how did they survive if they were not supposed to be very valuable?
Well, first of all, a lot of them didn't survive. A lot of what we have are pieces of shattered vases that get pieced together to create the scene. But a lot of them do survive in situations where frequently they were used, they were buried. They were part of funerary rituals. They were buried in tombs, and many of the very finest Greek vases were exported to Italy. the Etruscans were big admirers apparently of and they created a big export market for these vases, and then they buried a lot of their elite members of their society with this sort of material in their graves. So it's kind of haphazard, but
Paul,
a huge
John
amount
here.
of it. I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, Paul, so we don't have any biographical information about the painters beyond the name.
Exactly, not a line. There's no mention of them at all.
Because they were, presumably there were families of painters, and we don't know anything about that.
No, I mean, we know that, for example, there was a potter's quarter in Athens, which was the Kerameikos. And I was going to show this, but I felt it was, too much of a darling. But there's a kind of a relief image, a relief stela that was found in the Athenian Acropolis. It was a votive offering by a potter. So this was a potter who was very successful and had enough money to commission the creating of a relief that showed a potter at work that he dedicated to the goddess Athena on the Acropolis. And this is one of the few self-referential pieces that we have that show what the potter was in society. So we could see that they could be financially successful enough to be able to commission a work and have votive offerings on the Acropolis. But other than that, all we know are what we gauge, we can gather from actually examining their work and the inscriptions on their work.
Yeah, I've been reading a book on Ravenna that just came out recently. I recommend it, by Judith Herron, and she says that the situation is similar. She doesn't mention Greek god, but she said the situation is similar. The people who produced the famous Justinian and Theodoric mosaics, we know absolutely nothing about who they were. They were clearly of modest social standing, but the art they produced was highly valued, even by contemporaries. Artists don't have to be, that's kind of a romantic notion dating from Beethoven, is the artist has to be considered a genius above the normal run of humankind, but it wasn't that way in antiquity.
Well, that's a tremendous point. And, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but actually what we're going to see is part of the transition from this archaic world to the classical world is the beginning of the appreciation of the artist as an individual and the celebration of the artist and the individual. So this is presaged in other forms, not in the vase painting, but definitely in sculpture. By time we get to the high classical, the artists were famous throughout the world, this transition from the archaic world to the classical world, in many ways, is the creation of a modern mindset. And we'll see a lot of things that develop that we can identify with today as being the changes that occur in Greek society as we enter the classical period. One of them is this focus on the individual and the individual's accomplishments. So moving ahead, this is the fragment of a pot by Nearchos. We can see his name, which I've indicated over there. We're now kind of in the middle of the 6th century. And we can see that the black figure technique has really advanced to a stage of mastery. This is really exquisite work. In the scene, Achilles is harnessing his chariot team, which consists of the 2 immortal horses, Xanthos and Balios, and then a mortal horse that he puts together with them. They're interesting characters, the horses. They actually have one of them actually has a speaking role in the Iliad very briefly, where he's chided by Achilles because of his failure to bring Achilles' dear companion Patroclus back home, and the horse speaks to Achilles and says, "What are you talking about? This was the work of the god Apollo, and one day you're not coming home either." I did in the previous presentation really kind of focus on the way that the Black figure artists used their art to advance the heroic tradition, the heroic narrative. But there was another stream with this that was absolutely equal in importance and quantity. So we have to understand that a lot of the usage of these vases were all designed to be used. Even if the use was to be put in a grave, that's a use. But many of them were mixing bowls for wine. The Greeks did not drink their wine straight. They would basically dilute about 2 parts wine to 1 part water. And a lot of these bowls were huge mixing bowls that were designed to be used at parties called symposia. And then there were cups that were used to pour, and there were many different vessels that were designed for different uses. So then we look at this. Oh, I'm sorry, I once again went to the end. I got to get away from hitting that end button. So we were here. So this is the Bomford cup. And if you look at the bottom of the cup, you see male genitals. Now, we look at this and we would say, well, this is a crude joke. And certainly the Greeks, it was also a joke, but was it a crude joke to the Greeks? That's harder to say because the Greeks had a different attitude towards sexuality in general and homosexuality in particular. They had Leviticus was not part of their tradition, and so homoerotic sexuality had a respected place in the society, and in the same way that the vases celebrate the heroic tradition, here they're celebrating the celebration of life in the way that was understood by the Greeks, which included drinking, singing, and sexual enjoyment. And that happened in the context of these drinking parties, which were called symposia, which is the name of one of the famous dialogues of Plato, which takes place in the symposium. So this is a Black figure cup dated to the late Archaic period, and it was surely designed to be used at a symposia where wine and entertainment and sex were enjoyed. Here we're looking at the inside of the cup, which is called the tondo, and we see the face of Medusa, the Gorgon. Medusa was once a powerful feminine symbol with control over the natural cycle and in harmony with the worlds of earth and sky. She was killed by a man, Perseus, backed by the Olympian gods. Medusa is decapitated, and Perseus, after using her head as a weapon to turn people to stone, gives it as an offering to Zeus. Zeus takes the head and hangs it on his aegis, which is kind of a cloak that he uses, and he hangs the head on his aegis. So essentially what's happened is that the womanly power of Medusa has been now totally absorbed into the Olympian gods, the patriarchal Olympian god pantheon led by Zeus. Zeus often lends his aegis to Athena, and she uses it to great effect to terrorize her opponents. And we see it very frequently, almost all the time, in depictions of Athena. So if you look around the Gorgon's head are Black figure depictions of a series of symposium scenes. And the symposium is in full swing. So here we have a man reclining on a couch. A woman offers him a large cup of wine in what's called a kylix. and the woman is almost certainly what is called a hetera. Hetera were courtesans. So, which is, once again, the way that our society looks at it, we say, oh, she's a whore. So did they have sex with their patrons? Absolutely, they did. But they were distinguished from what we might call common prostitutes, and also by the Greeks, who did have a word for common prostitutes, which they called porne, the root of our word pornography. But heterae had to be able to entertain a very sophisticated audience with conversation and with music. Hetera translates literally as companion. And it was the exact same word that was used to refer to the close comrades of Alexander the Great, and are known to history as the elite companion cavalry of Alexander, the striking armor of his force, using the same word as these prostitutes. Detail number 2, back to the symposium. We see a turbaned symposiast, making a grand gesture with his hand across his chest. He's accompanied by a flute player on the aulos, the double flute. And an interesting detail is look at the modest dress of the musician compared to the party goer, indicating that the musician is working. He's not a member of the symposium. He is part of the crew, if you will, that throws the symposium, that provides some accompaniment to the symposiasts who are going to sing to entertain each other. And very possibly this is done at the home or the establishment of the hetera who's hosting the party.
Hey, Paul?
Yeah.
Isn't the fact that the musician is seems to be lying down and has a pillow under him might indicate he's a guest? Or would the musicians, wouldn't they have been standing?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the part of it is that, we're looking at something that's, this is a circular a depiction. So the angle is a little distorted, but yes, I agree that he's on a couch, but the interpretation that he is hired is a scholarly interpretation, and so I'll present it for what it's worth. Certainly, one could make an argument the other way. We see a lyre, actually, a cathera, kind of lying in the center, and I would interpret that, the way that you now see musicians, see guitar players, and while they're playing behind them, they have a rack of the rest of their guitars all lined up. That's how I see that this is another musical instrument in this guy's bag of tricks that he can pull out and use when he needs to.
Well, I have a broader question. What do you think, did the musicians in general had the same prestige as, let's say, artists, or who did the busts and whatever?
There is
in that society.
I don't believe that there is any musicians celebrated as composers as we think about them now, or as instrumental virtuosos as we think about them now. The main way that we hear musical performance celebrated is in the context of poetry. So
yeah, we don't know any specifically musicians, right? Names of any musicians.
That's correct.
So it probably means that they didn't have the same stature even as a artist. Certainly, the actors and dramatists know that it's a lot of prestige, but musicians seem to be having the least prestige of them all.
I agree, but also note that the high status individuals themselves participated in these things. So For example, famously, Achilles is depicted as sitting in his tent and playing the lyre when he's approached by the embassy coming from King Agamemnon to beg him to go back and join the fight. And he's sitting in his couch playing his beautiful lyre and singing. And when Greg, when you presented on Pericles, in the beginning of that piece by Plutarch actually talks about how, well, people really, you really, as a high status individual, you shouldn't waste your time playing the lyre because you'll never be as good as a professional musician. And it's unsuited, it's unfitting. You should spend your time trying to perfect your virtue because that is fitting for your stature. So
yeah, I wonder if a lyre was more used as an accompaniment.
oh, absolutely. I think it's like a guitar.
Yeah.
You accompany yourself while you're singing. Absolutely. So, the third scene on the Bomford Cup kind of drips with sexual innuendo. We see a small boy carrying a wine jug, and he's reaching out to an elegantly dressed man who's on a couch kind of leaning forward, and he's got a shoe in his hand, and he seems like he's about to slap the boy with his shoe, or maybe he's already slapped him with his shoe. And the small boy seems to be entreating him. Maybe there's a sexual tinge to this, and we see on the left another symposiast watching with great interest to see what's going on here. So the scenes of a symposium, and as I say, the interesting thing about it is that this cup that we're looking at it's self-reflexive. It's showing pictures of the way people could have been drinking from that very cup as scenes like this were occurring.
Hey, Paul, I'm curious, I know in the Arab world, showing the bottom of your foot or your shoe is considered an insult. And I remember a journalist throwing his shoes at George W. Bush in Baghdad one time. I wonder if this extends to ancient Greece, that the bottom of the bottom of your foot or your shoe is an insult. Would this been, is there any connection to be drawn?
I don't know. I really don't know. All I can say is that there's a frequent reference in Homer to one of these scenes that comes again and again in Homer are characters getting dressed, in particular arming themselves for battle. And one of the things that they do is they put on their beautiful golden sandals, their shining sandals, which they put on. So that doesn't directly address your question, and there are other scenes of people using their shoe in a similar way, but it's not as a serious weapon. More than that, I can't say. I certainly don't. I'm not aware of any thing that's similar to the, throwing your shoes or Khrushchev banging his shoe on the desk at the United Nations or anything like that. So
it seems to be a pretty, stretched, argument about connection. It seems to be very unlikely that there's any connection.
But it certainly seems to be clear here that, there's a status difference between the richly dressed symposiast. The small figure is naked. He's seems to be entreating him in some way. And so you just get a sense of kind of slapping around the servant. At least that's the way that it appears to me. So to review Black Figure, we've been spending a lot of time on it. Let's talk about what Black Figure does, its strengths and weaknesses. So because of the black silhouette against the bright surface, Black Figure is extremely good at depicting gestures. See the gestures of the the hands of the figure on the left and the woman in the center. I'm going to be showing you here for basically scenes that were executed by Ezekias, who is the finest black figure master, maybe the Rembrandt of black figure. And this vase depicts the twins, Castor and Polydeucus, who are better known by the Latin names Castor and Pollux. But if you've heard the expression, put up your dukes, Polydeucus was a famous boxer. Many hands. The twins were brothers of Helen of Troy, and it's possible, actually I think that the woman is not Helen of Troy. I think the writing represents her as Leda, who is the mother of the twins and Helen of Troy. And we see Polydeucus reaching down to let his dog, and how often have you seen your puppy jumping up to wag his tail furiously and lick your hand, and here he's happy to let the dog sniff his hand, and Leda offers a flower, and we can't see it, it's off to the right, to her other son, the twin Castor. And here we see another Ezekias masterpiece. This is the combat of Achilles and Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons. The black figure technique here is clearly extremely effective in communicating power and violence. Achilles looks like a machine with no soul, no mercy. But at the same time, it's more complicated, because what the Greek audience knew when they viewed this vase is that right at the moment depicted by Ezekias, when the spear penetrates Penthesilea's neck, their eyes locked, and Achilles fell deeply in love with her. So that's one of the many tragedies embedded in this Trojan epic cycle. And then my favorite of the Ezekias work is this, and again, in the hands of this great master, we see black figure able to convey a complex set of emotions. Ajax has been first enraged over the fact that the armor of Achilles, which he thought he deserved, was awarded to Odysseus instead of to him through the machinations of Agamemnon and Odysseus, backed by Athena, and Athena drove him mad. And in his madness, he thought that he would go and try to kill all the leaders of the Greek army. But in his madness, instead, he went and killed all their sheep, who he took for them. And then when he came to his senses, he had lost everything. He was totally humiliated. He was seen as a traitor. He was seen as a madman, and his life was over. Everything that was important to him. And understand that this is a shame society where the way people think of you is everything. And he now had nothing. But now, as we see in this picture, he's meditative. He knows there's nothing left for him, but he's at this point kind of reconciled himself that now this is what he must do. And he calmly prepares to arrange his sword and fall on his sword. And that's very much in harmony and congruence with the nature of Ajax as presented by Sophocles, the Athenian tragedian, though note that that is 100 years after this vase.
And the Odysseus trying to talk him out of it, right?
Yeah. Yes, definitely in right. And in the Odyssey, when Odysseus goes to the underworld, he sees the ghost of Ajax and tries to talk to him, but Ajax won't speak with him. Ajax turns his back and walks away. He's harboring the grudge. He won't forgive him. And then this is the final piece. One of the most maybe the most widely known black figure vase And in it, we can see this phenomenal precision that was in the hands of Ezekias. Professor Milanopoulos made the comment that in the hands of Ezekias, the stylus becomes a brush. And the richness of their apparel and their nobility is so greatly projected by this. There's a lot more to this that I've talked about before, but I don't want to repeat that now. But the question then is raised when you get to this point of where can you go with black figure? Is it possible to actually take it to something new? Or has Ezekias basically created the end of black figure history? Well, here's where it goes.
Can I ask
Yeah,
a
go ahead.
question before you continue? In most of these figures, they are mythological stories, right? And there is the Odyssey, and that means that they were popular. People understood that he's doing this, and you know that. So what I don't get, you know, it's kind of confusing to me. It's like philosophy was a very important subject in Greece at the time. They have all these different schools, discussions.
Let me interrupt you there, because you're conflating two times. So the beginnings of philosophy as we know it were happening kind of in the late Archaic period in the city of Miletus. We see Thales, we see Anaximander and Anaximenes, and then Heraclitus. But the period of really philosophical flowering at Athens that we associate with Plato and with Socrates is 100 years later than this. Okay, so this we're talking now about the Archaic period, and as I say, so this was beginning to flower in Ionia, but even then. Philosophy in its beginnings was mostly concerned with what we would now call science, physics, trying to determine what is the primary stuff of existence. Is it air, fire, water, with different answers being put forward, and then later, Socrates kind of, dismisses that and makes philosophy focus on ethics and on epistemology. How do we know what we know, and things like that. So those developments are happening 100 years, or a little more than 100 years after these things are being developed. But at the same time, the fact that a good point that you make is that the audience for these things knew these myths inside and out. They followed these myths the way that we would, we have people who know every scene in The Godfather, right? My wife and I talk to each other in terms of scenes in The Godfather, or scenes in movies that mean very much to us. That's the way the Greeks understood this. So these scenes were used to decorate their symposia because they were all tremendously interested in it, and they made jokes about it. But it's also, you also have to keep in mind, and that's why I showed this before, is that at least half of the art of the vase painting that we have was not about heroic scenes, but it was about getting drunk and chasing of satyrs with erections, chasing
heroic.
absolutely erotic stuff, and drinking and having a good time, So there's, I tend to focus on the heroic because I'm interested in it, and that's why I wanted to present a counterpose to that, and understand that both of those, the amount of time and effort devoted to them is kind of about equal. So where do we go from black figure? Well, we begin to see the answer in the work of the Achilles Painter in the last years of the 6th century. And so what we're looking at here is a copy of this is I call this the gamers, Achilles and Ajax. And here we see a decent copy in black figure of those people. But when we turn this vase around to the other side, here's something new. It's the same scene, but it's inverse. The left is black figure, the right is red figure. So the emergence of red figure, we know about. The earliest examples that we have are vases of this kind that are called bilingual vases, which have the same scene, one side in black figure and the other side in red figure. And for this, and a lot of them, these earliest ones are attributed to the Achilles Painter. And if you read things on Wikipedia and places like that, they'll attribute red figures to be the invention of the Achilles Painter. Professor Milanopoulos says absolutely not. He says that the appearance of the quality of the red figure work when we get to these bilingual vases is already so advanced that this cannot be the beginning of red figure. It had to have a history of significant development before we get to see that. The second thing is that they're not done by the same hand. I mean, Beasley himself went back and forth. Did the Achilles Painter paint both? And ultimately he decided that they didn't. And he attributed the black figure piece to somebody that he called the Lysipides Painter. But in any event, that's where we begin to see the emergence of red figure, kind of saying, well, we really can't top Ezekiel. We have to find some new way of expressing themselves. So the question is, what's so special about red figure? What can be done with red figure that cannot be done with black figure? So consider the vase by Ezekiel depicting Achilles and Penthesilea. Despite the raw power conveyed in the scene, at the same time, there's a flatness to the images. They don't seem to really occupy space. Achilles' chest is completely frontal, and there's no natural connectivity. If you look and you see his legs are in profile, but there's no twist to his waist, right? His body, torso faces you, but his legs are sideways, and there's no transition between the two, kind of like the head of an owl. The artist gives us some sense of three-dimensionality because of the way, if you look at the inside rim of the shields, you can see that the inside of the shield, which is kind of dark red, and the Greek shields are often described as hollow shields because of their convexity, that you could put it over your shoulder and you kind of, it's, as I say, it's a convex shape. And he uses that to show some sense of 3D. But when you look at things like their garments, look at the folds of the bottom of, I guess that's a peplos that's peeping out the bottom of underneath Achilles' breastplate. But instead of looking like the folds of drapery, they're tessellated. They're two-dimensional.
Did he forget to wear his pants?
Well, no, the showing of frequently the combatants are shown completely naked. But the showing of the penis is a convention of Greek art. The Greeks had an obsession with showing the male penis, and there's a huge literature about it. Not well read in it, but it is somehow an identification of the male nature of this society, of the importance of a man, of the asserting the superiority of a man.
And also erection means courage. It's the
No,
identification
no,
of
I think
courage
that's wrong. I
sometimes.
think that's wrong because
That's what I read.
there actually, you never see a heroic male with an erection. You almost never see a human figure with an erection. The erections are almost always satyrs, which are half man and half goat, or the god Pan, who's all goat, or the head of a goat in the body of a man. But you almost never see a man with an erection. It was kind of considered bad taste. And in fact, having a large penis was considered bad taste.
Yeah, the
But
Greeks
in
always, they
literature,
have
in
the small
literature, it's
penis.
different.
I'm sorry?
In Greek, I mean, always they show the Greeks with a small penis.
Yes, and that was considered the ideal.
Yeah.
And the idea of a large penis was gross. And we do start to see that when we get into Hellenistic art, which I'm not going to get to today, but in Hellenistic art, you start getting a really modern sensibility of showing people as they actually are with their deformities and their age, whereas up till this point, the Greeks wanted to show people as idealized and perfect, and perfection meant a small penis. So, let me move on from there, but the main point that I'm making here about this two-dimensionality is that the figures are more symbols than they are real portraits. Now compare this. This is red figure, and just look at the difference. This is a depiction of the goddess Artemis, and look at the swaying drapery of her long skirt and how that conveys motion. Both Artemis and Penthesilea are in a kind of a prototypical conventional position. They're moving in one direction, but their head is looking back in the other direction over their shoulder. But if you look at Penthesilea, her head, there's no twist in her head. But if you look at Artemis, there's a twist in her waist.
There's much more
and she
volume.
occupies space. Yes, that's what I mean when I say that she occupies space. Her posture is plausible and naturalistic, and she creates an illusion of three-dimensionality that the black figure does not. And we see lightness and grace, which the black figure is not very good at grace. It's as if Artemis is dancing, and the delicacy of her face. So perhaps black figure masters could have achieved some of this, but they basically did not attempt it.
Paul.
Yeah.
Ralph here. Just a comment. This the black figure type profile is also characteristic of Egyptian art. And the interpretation I've seen there is each part of the body is depicted in its most characteristic form. So the head and face are always in profile. The shoulders are always sideways. The feet are always in profile because that's sort of the formal way they're always depicted. Now, I think it's interesting here, the red figure is a sort of a partial move that way. Actually, the left one foot is strictly in profile, although it's rather awkward that the foot is pointing backwards while she's facing forwards, but the other foot is not in profile, and that's a dramatic change. And pretty much everything we've seen so far, the feet are always strictly in profile. Here, the face is is exactly in profile, but as you say, the shoulders are now rotated. So this has a bit of elements of both. Some elements are strictly profile, even at the expense, even at somewhat awkward realism, whereas other parts are now starting to move away from the strict profile. Thanks.
Those are fantastic points. Fantastic points. So the tremendous influence of Egyptian art on the Greeks, and in many ways, the history of Greek art is the history of how they transformed the patterns that they learned from the Egyptians and made them into something that was uniquely Greek. And it happens so many times in so many different contexts. So that's absolutely correct. When you look at the figure of Artemis, I mean, it's not just, you know, you say that her foot in profile, but look at the continuation into her knee. So it really does kind of, and her other foot is kind of pivoting, and look how the toes kind of violate the ground line, right? So there's a ground line on the vase, and that kind of makes the figure kind of pop off the vase into your face, right? It's like she's jumping off the movie screen.
A point about patterns. I've been watching the concentric circle that's been appearing for a while. And a number of years ago, I purchased a necklace with that same pattern in Athens and was told that that is symbolic of eternity. Can you speak to that?
I don't know. I mean, I can't, but let me just say this, that the interesting thing is that when you go all the way back to the early geometric period, the only painting on the vase were things like concentric circles. There was nothing else. They'd have a couple of wavy lines, and they'd have some concentric circles, and that was 100% of what they did. So, you know, the Greek art shows a combination of conservatism and innovation, and the conservatism is embodied in the continuation of things like these concentric circles and the continuation of profile faces and things like that, though they're constantly innovating and going from two-dimensionality to three-dimensionality and so forth.
So just a concentric circle, or it's like a snail kind of shape?
They had concentric circles.
They
had concentric circles. They had spirals.
Spirals, yeah, that could represent the infinity, the spirals, because they just.
And a lot of that stuff was influenced from the East. I didn't talk about it here. I did last time, but we had this thing called the Orientalizing Period, which was in the 700s and early 600s, when there was a huge influx of motifs and patterns from the East, as the Greeks, at the same time that the alphabet came from the same place into Greece. And that's when things like these circles kind of transform themselves into floral patterns and things like that.
Paul, maybe not at this point, but if it's not convenient, but somewhere along the line, could you sort of discuss about how you envision these objects existed within Greek culture? I assume these are objects owned by, obviously, the upper class, since these were finely made, expensive luxury items. But do you see that, was that not true? Maybe there was.
Well, here's the idea.
And did they sit around the house, you know, or they just sort of positioned on shelves and stuff, or what?
I think it's like, you know, in house, you've got your everyday dishes and your good china. I think it's kind of like that, you know, and depending on how affluent you are, you know, your good china may essentially, well, if we look back, you know, 100 years ago, your good china was silver, or it was fine porcelain taken from China. So the Greek, the pots were always functional, and there were the vast majority of this was humble stuff. You know, a bowl, amphora that were used to ship masses of olive oil and wine from place to place. So it was all functional, but the finer stuff would have elevated function. So they'd use it for their fancy parties.
So, for example, all the vases that they export oil, were they painted and was a little more?
Probably not. If you have a vase that's just sitting in the hold of a ship, that's you're just holding, you know, olive oil to be transported from one place to another, it would not be painted at all. But when they were providing luxury items, like, for example, perfume came in small bottles called aribolos, and the aribolos were decorated, and sometimes they weren't. They were just geometric but ultimately they became to be rather fancy. So just in the same way that today, you know, a bottle of perfume is extremely expensive, and whenever you get something extremely expensive, it comes with much more expensive packaging. I think that the same thing stands, that when you were selling a really a luxury item, or something that was designed to be consumed in the context of something that the rich folks did more than the ordinary folks, you wanted to make your wares as attractive as possible, because these potters were competing with each other. So it was a commercial type of situation where when you're selling a luxury good and you have the eye of someone that could buy it from you, or you can buy it from somebody in the shop two doors away, you have to have something that will make him say, well, I want yours. So that's my view of what you've got here.
And then I assume then the upper 2% would have been sort of the style leaders. In other words, at some point they decide, well, we're going to go from, you know, black ware to red ware. And
well, that's interesting. That's a real interesting point, because the potter had to have this balance between not going too far past what his audience was willing to accept, at the same time not just wanting to do the same thing again and again and again. Well, let's say the people, the painters that we consider artists were looking to do something new, but they were constrained by what their audience was willing to accept. So you don't typically see avant-garde pot painting, as now today you'd see avant-garde artists where, you know, people will look at it and say, that's art. You didn't have that in those days. The level of innovation was always kind of tempered by the need to appeal to people's tastes. So somebody, you know, someone took you know, said, well, let me try this newfangled idea I had about black figure, and then let's see if it sells. And it sold. It caught on. It became popular. So I think that's kind of what we're looking at here.
Awesome. Thank you.
Paul, I have a question that's actually posed from Jane, and that is, was there something about the red figure technique that allowed them to express volume and things greater, or was it just a stylistic change?
Yes, there is. Yes. So I think I cut this out because I was running late, but it's as I said, they both use the exact same technique in the sense that they have this 3-stage firing method in which you take your vase and then you use this slip in which you paint the areas that you want to turn out black. So in the left, in the black figure technique, the things that you want to turn out black is the figure itself. And the background is light colored by contrast. And if you want to have details in your black figure, you have to kind of scratch through the black with a stylus. And the lines that you scratch turn out to be light colored because you've exposed the clay underneath, and that's what happens in the firing process. But in red figure, you do the opposite. You paint the background black, and you leave the place where you want the figure to be just raw clay. And then you paint details with a brush. So the basic point is that the brush is a much more sensitive and flexible instrument than the stylus. I mean, just think of a dentist's pick and an artist's brush, right? When you use a pick, you're scraping, you're fighting against friction all the way. When you're using a brush in the hands of someone who's practiced and skilled and talented, it's flowing. It's got a whole, you know, no, there's things that you can do with the brush that you just can't do with a stylus because of its very nature. So that kind of accounts, as you see, this is a really fabulous example of that, you know, of how it's because you can use the brush for your details instead of the stylus that allows you to get all of this different feeling of lightness and grace and elegance that you don't see in black figure. And I wanted to take just a minute to show you, because this is actually kind of a high classical thing, and I'm not going to get to this artist today. It's by somebody called the Pan Painter, but I just wanted to show you the whole scene. This is a scene which is about Artemis and Actaeon. Actaeon was a hunter, and Artemis was the huntress goddess. And Actaeon had the very, very bad luck to be out hunting one day and accidentally see Artemis taking a bath in a stream. And Artemis was very, very unhappy about this. She's the virgin goddess, and immediately started firing her arrows at Actaeon, who started turning into a stag and was then attacked by his own hunting dogs and ripped to pieces as he was turned into what would be a prey animal for the hunter. And just an interesting reflection, I was thinking about this morning, really on the difference between the Greek classical, the Greco-Roman mentality and the Judeo-Christian mentality. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, when God does something bad to you, it's almost always because you screwed up. You did something bad. You were evil, you sinned. But in the Greek tradition, that's not necessary at all. The gods did bad things to you because that's their nature. And bad things happen to people. And it happens to people when it's not their fault at all. And one might say that that gives that's associated with the realism that we think of from the Greeks, the rationality that we think of from the Greeks, as distinct from the everything turns out right and God is with us all the time, that some people find themselves rejecting in later life as experience catches up with dogma.
Well, the Greek gods and goddesses were all much more human. They have, fears, and they were crazy, and they'd sin, and they did everything that we do. So.
But the other thing to keep in mind is that they had no respect for human beings, right? They considered human beings like little ants walking across their toes that they could squash at any time. And again and again and again, they'll say, well, why should we fight among ourselves over humans? They're nothing. They don't matter. The only humans that matter to the gods are their own children, or particular individual favorites, like Odysseus is a favorite of Athena. But the idea that the Jewish or the Christian or Christ, their relationship to human beings of actually caring about them, that's the unique contribution of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay, so back to, what happens is that red figure becomes completely ubiquitous after this period of this, and there's only one carryover of black figure, which we're looking at here, which are called the Pan Athenaic Vases. So there was something in Athens called the Pan Athenaic Games. They were like the Olympic Games. The Greeks had 4 different games that were pan-Hellenic. One of them would happen every 4 years, and then they would go in a cycle. So the Olympics would happen every 4 years, and then in the intervening years, you'd have the Panathenaic Games, you'd have the Delphic Games at Delphi, and you'd have what were called the Isthmian Games, and referring to the Isthmus of Corinth. So for some reason, the Pan Athenaic vase prizes were these vases, and they continued to be done in black figure, and it's the only black figure that is continued after this period. So as we now move into we're moving forward in time, there's really nothing except red figure. Pardon me for a second here. So the first group of red figure painters that are known to us are known as the pioneer group. And
just Paul, could I just interrupt for a second?
Please.
On these black and red backgrounds, the yellow or the red figure is simply the raw clay.
It's the clay after it's been fired.
Now, is the black the same, or is the black a slip? Is the back a glaze?
Let me explain how it works then.
Yeah,
Okay.
you did it last time.
I'll explain how it works. It's really quite ingenious. So it has to do with understanding the chemical properties of clay and the way that it reacts with oxygen. So clay, when it gets heated to around, and I don't remember the numbers, but I think it was around 700 degrees centigrade in the presence of oxygen, turns a color that's based on the impurities or the minerals that are in the clay. So the Athenian clay turned a deep red. Corinthian clay turned a very rich yellow, golden yellow. And these were very good clays. And that's what would happen. If you then heated it further up to like 900 degrees centigrade and you removed oxygen, which you could do basically by putting wet branches in the fire source, which releases smoke into the kiln and drives the oxygen out. What happens then is that all of the clay turns black. So what happens is when you paint an area with the slip, which is clay, the property of the slip is that when you reach that 900 centigrade heat, it melts and it forms an airtight bond with the clay underneath. So then what the Greeks did, that's the second phase of the process. And the third phase of the process was to reduce the temperature back to 700 degrees and let the oxygen back in. So what would happen is that the exposed areas of clay in the presence of oxygen would turn red again. And the incised lines would turn red. But the areas that had been covered by the slip had now formed an airtight barrier against the clay underneath it, and the oxygen could not reach the clay. So that would stay black.
Does that mean, so the slip was transparent?
Well, the slip was very, very thin, but it had this sense of creating, as I say, an airtight protective layer that would prevent the clay from reacting when the oxygen was readmitted to the kiln.
Okay, but the black and the yellow are both colors of clay depending on the oxidizing conditions.
Right, heat and oxygen, that's right. And then they would add additional colors. So where you see like a brown color or a white color, that's additional paint. And the paint that you see in black figure is also additional paint, usually put on before firing, but not always. Okay,
Thanks.
So on to the early masters of black figure.
This is gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous vase. I mean, this is incredible.
So yeah, so this is as I say, this first group of painters was called the Pioneer Group, and the leading member was Euphronius, active. And let me just take a moment to underline, please note this time frame, 520 to 475 BC. This is the transition between, the late Archaic period is usually defined as being from like 525 to 490 or something like that. So we're showing here, we're focusing their life, his active lifespan was this transitional period between the Archaic and the Classical. And this crater is maybe the most famous vase in the world. It's known as the Euphronius crater or the Sarpedon crater. There are articles in the New York Times whenever it gets moved from one museum to another. The scene that's depicted here is of the hero, the corpse of the hero Sarpedon, being taken from Troy so he can be returned to his homeland. Sarpedon was the king of a place called Lycia, would say the correct English translation, English pronunciation, and he's a character in the Iliad. And he's really interesting because he is chosen to lay out the ideology of aristocracy. And so Sarpedon, in a scene, asks his close buddy, he says, why do our countrymen give us the best food and drink? Why do they give us fertile farms on the best land? Why do they give us great herds of sheep and cattle? And the answer is we earn these by risking our lives fighting in the front ranks where the danger is greatest. And in Homer, he says, now, while the threat of death is upon us, death that is everywhere, death that no mortal can evade, let us advance either to our own glory or to that of others.
Hey, Paul, just a couple of questions. The figure in the middle is carrying a rod of some sort.
Hold that, please hold it. Just one. I'm just going to get right to this second, okay? And so just hold it for 2 minutes. So death is what Sarpedon finds on the battlefield at the hands of Patroclus, Achilles' close companion, and Sarpedon happens to be a son of Zeus, of which, Zeus has got lots of sons running around because he's prone to infatuation with mortal women. So Zeus sees that Patroclus is about to get killed by Patroclus, and he's very troubled. And he muses about whether he should save Sarpedon. But the other gods say, you can't do that, you can't do that. Not even you should change what was decreed by fate. And then they say, but don't worry, what you can do is give him a good burial. And so Zeus commands a god, and that is Hermes. And so what you see in Hermes' hands is the caduceus, the symbol of Hermes, and he has the hat with wings on it, and you can see the feet of Hermes have boots with wings. Zeus commands him to take the brothers sleep and death, Hypnos and Thanatos. And interestingly, Thanatos' name is spelled backwards because it's coming from his mouth, right? The T, or the theta, is closest to his mouth, and then it goes right to left, though the other names are going left to right. And have sleep and death carry him back to his homeland and let him be buried in his motherland. And I had always kind of said, well, why is this such a big deal? But I'm beginning to understand that this was a tremendous big deal to the Greeks. And real burial was a huge thing. Patroclus' ghost comes back to Achilles, his dearest friend, and says, what's the matter with you? Bury me. You have to bury me. I'm in horrible limbo until you bury me. Odysseus, when he goes to the underworld, has one of his companions who fell off a roof come back to him and say, go back to where I fell off the roof and bury me. Promise me that you'll do it. And Odysseus does it, and Odysseus doesn't keep very many of his promises. So that's kind of remarkable. And in fact, Sarpedon is the only figure in the entire Iliad who has ever returned to his homeland for burial. So it was something very special to the Greeks, a big deal. Did that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, I had two more, if you don't mind.
Please, go ahead.
One, all of those gods seem to have beards, and the king does not have a beard. I'm curious whether that is symbolic of anything. And then a perspective question: the king, the blood flowing out of the king is not going straight down; it's at an angle to the lower left. And I wonder if that means anything.
It may indicate, the motion, that as they pick him up. In terms of the question of beards, male figures are basically depicted as either mature or young. And young people are depicted beardless, and in particular, Apollo is always depicted beardless. Zeus, Poseidon are always depicted bearded. And some heroes are depicted both ways. So there are some artists that depict Achilles, as we saw in the Players, is got a beard, and in other depictions of Achilles, he's a young man and he's beardless. So, I don't think there's a specific thing that you can say. It has something to do with what the artist is trying to convey. There's a sense that a younger bearded man is more of an erotic symbol than a beardless man. Younger man is appropriate as a subject of erotic desire in a way that an older man with a beard is not. So maybe that has something to do with it. It basically shows you that he was a youth, and maybe here it's designed to give more poignancy to his early death. He had his whole life ahead of him.
Thanks.
You're welcome. The other side of the same vase shows a wrestling match between, this is one of the great events in the life of Heracles. He is wrestling with the giant Antaeus. And at this point, and Antaeus is a son of the earth. And Heracles hasn't figured out yet that as long as Antaeus is on the ground in contact with the earth, he can never beat him, because the earth keeps, his mother keeps refreshing his strength. And ultimately, Hercules figures this out, and he lifts Antaeus up above his head, at which point Antaeus is no longer able to refresh his strength, and Hercules is able to kill him.
By the way, just wanted to add that this is the beginning of the wrestling. That they were using this Greek wrestling, Greek style wrestling.
And in fact, well, I mean, wrestling is mentioned repeatedly in Homer, both in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So when Patroclus dies, there are funeral games, like because just to jump a second, we all know about Roman gladiators, but what we don't often know is that gladiatorial games were originally exclusively done in the context of funerals. It was part of a funeral celebration. So, and it goes back to the Greeks, the idea that you have athletic contests to basically, in the same way that in New Orleans you have a marching band, in Greece you had chariot races and boxing and wrestling. And Odysseus is presented as a champion wrestler, and he wrestles with the young men in the island of Phaeacia. So that goes back at least to Homer, which is the mid 700s. But one thing that people do point out in this image is to contrast the grooming of Hercules compared to Antaeus. So Heracles is immaculately groomed. He's just come from the hairdresser. And Antaeus is just kind of, all over the place. So what we're looking at is a conflict between a civilized Greek and a barbarian. And the giants, in general, were the more primitive barbarians who were conquered by the civilized Olympian gods who brought civilization to humanity. Professor Malinopoulos praises Euphronius' amazing accuracy in details and describes him as the red figure version of Ezekiel, who pushed even further in terms of the varied postures of his subjects. His trademarks are large eyes with luxurious long lashes, often using thick layers of slip to create relief-like effects for eyebrows and beards. moving on, and now further into, well, still in this transitional period, we have someone called the Cleophrates Painter. And we're essentially at this point in his work leaving the late archaic period and arriving in the classical period. And his greatest work, his most best known work, is a vase which depicts the sack of Troy. I'm sorry, and that's very, very interesting because of the way it does the depiction. I've shown previously that the Greeks essentially celebrated the cruelty in warfare. Decapitated heads, men, women, and children being killed in the context of a siege. That was all seen as great stuff. But we're seeing something different in this scene. So what we're looking at here, as I say, this is the final moments in the sack of Troy. The woman that we're looking at here is Cassandra, and she is holding on to the cult image of Athena. So the woman with the helmet and the shield and the spear is a statue. And you see the base of what he's standing on. This is the altar of Athena. So Cassandra has been grabbing, and this was sanctuary. I mean, we have in the medieval world, we have this idea that if you go into a church and you claim sanctuary, your enemies have to respect that and you have to leave you alone. Well, the ancient world had that same idea, which is that if you sought sanctuary in a temple of a god, it was an abomination that the gods would punish if you violated that. And violating that, as we see here, is the second Ajax. This is not the same Ajax who committed suicide. This is Ajax, the son of Oileus, and he's got a fancy for Cassandra. This is the rape of Cassandra. And by the way, Milanopoulos says that this frontal nudity with pubic hair is tremendously rare, almost never seen. And so, and you notice that the Trojans are fighting back. At Ajax's feet is a dead Greek, because the Greeks are armed. The Trojans are not armed because they were caught unawares when the Greeks came out of the horse at night. You see to the right, you see other women cowering there. And to the left, I think that's another statue, and you see a Greek with his shield carrying off that statue. So on the other side, you see the even greater horror.
Excuse me, Paul, I have a question.
Sure.
Where were these found? Is this ubiquitous? And are they preserved, or were these all put together? In other words,
I believe this one
to me that you would have very many of them that were whole that would last. So
I don't know the answer to where this is found, where it was discovered, and where it is now. So I'm sorry.
No, not this individual one. Overall, are they the ones that we're looking at?
It's just dumb luck. Whatever survived is just dumb luck. It was buried in a tomb and nobody disturbed it.
Would these then be representative of, or are these I just want to understand whether these are spectacular individual examples, or at the time this would have been something moderately common and ubiquitous.
Well, I'm showing you the best of the best. So there's a lot of stuff by very mediocre artists, and it's very repetitive, and a lot of the draftsmanship is very poor. So the really great stuff is a small fraction, and the great masters are a smaller fraction of that.
But did you say they come from tombs?
Many of them come from tombs. Many of them.
Would that sort of bias what we're seeing in terms of the stories and things that are on there?
you know, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are some scholarly attempts to link the you know, for example, grave offerings to specific narratives that make it appropriate for that to be there. And sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in our, you know, current culture. So if you looked at just grave art or something like that, you would see a very different view than you
Yeah.
might see. But
And if you look at history, there's a, you know, there are times when people were just interred one way or another, and then sometimes they were buried with fantastic grave goods, and then sometimes then it would stop. You know, the greatest example of this is the Great Pyramids of Egypt, right? That's the biggest grave good that you'll ever see. All that is a big grave. And so the extremes of high to low are just, you know, huge, and I can't explain, you know, exactly in each case the whys and the wheres. So
and I think in this case also it works great with the curvature of the vase. I mean, when you
yes,
see all the black spaces, you know, it's very rhythm, you know, how the figures get together, and they all, I mean, there are a lot of figures, a lot of things going on, but they are all so clear. I mean, this is gorgeous. I mean, this is.
yeah, and you're absolutely right that a lot of their art involved taking advantage of the shape of the vase to foreshorten or to show curvature, and that's absolutely right. They took advantage of whatever they could take advantage of, and having, you know, these what you call violation of the ground line or the headline. Once again, the male figure in the center with his hand raised is Neoptolemus, who's the son of Achilles, and you see the way his helmet violates the top line. It's kind of a way of having the figures pop out. So what's happening here is that the figure who's sitting there with his hands over his head covered with blood is King Priam. And in his lap is the child Astyanax, who's the son of Hector. And interestingly, I mean, you see liberties taken by the vase painters in order to be able to tell a story graphically. They will depart from the way the story is told in the written text. So in the written text, Astyanax is basically thrown off the walls of Troy. You know, they smack him around and throw him off the walls by his feet. But here, they show him on Priam's lap in the temple, and the great sacrilege, Neoptolemus, after having killed Astyanax, is now killing Priam. There's another dead Greek at Neoptolemus's feet, and if you look on the right top, it's a really interesting thing. You see the Trojans fighting back. So you see a Greek who's kind of been beaten to his knees, and then above him is a Trojan who's hitting him with a table leg. Right? He's not armed. He's wearing his, you know, his normal clothing, and he's picked up a leg of a piece of furniture, and he's fighting back against the Greeks. And so one could say that this is kind of a real change in the way that people depicted warfare. You know, you could say here that this is depiction of war crimes. Let's say that this is the beginning of a tradition that reaches its peak with the Guernica, of showing the horrors of war, as opposed to making it this great heroic adventure. So it's by many scholars seen as a kind of an anti-war statement, or at least a statement to dispel the heroic myth and show the horrors of which men are capable of inflicting on each other.
Paul, one stylistic item that kind of catches my eye are those little squiggles of blood. It seems kind of, it certainly adds to the dynamism of the scene, but stylistically, it seems kind of careless as compared to, you know, the beautiful linearity of the rest of the composition.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I think the same thing was even true in the Sarpedon crater that we looked at before, and it was commented on. More than that, I can't say. The only thing I can say is that a lot of these painters came from workshops. So possibly some of the detail could have been added by a less talented apprentice, or I can't explain it. You know, you're absolutely right in saying that the depiction of the blood doesn't seem to be on the same level as the rest of the painting, and I can't tell you why.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
Now into the classical, we reach one of the finest of Greek vase painters, called the Berlin Painter. And so we're looking at the beginning of the high classical period, and the hallmark of the Berlin Painter is his use of extremely shiny black backdrops. The vases were polished with leather before they were fired. And against this, the Berlin Painter likes to paint one or perhaps two figures only. So the Berlin Painter was not the first to do this. We saw this done, for example, by Ezekiel with his Ajax. But the Berlin Painter fully realized the form. And frequently he did not paint any ground line at all, as in this case. The figure seemed to float in air. Here we have I believe it's a woman, though I'm not absolutely sure. It could be a young man, playing the kithara as he or she sings, plucks the strings with her left hand, and you can just see that there's a plectrum in her right hand that she strummed across the strings. And here's a very similar scene with an older man basically doing the same thing, and there's a very nice touch, which is his little dog following him around and maybe enjoying the procession as his master has had a few too many kylixes of that fine wine and is now prancing around and singing his head off. And I think this is the last pot that I'm going to show, also by the Berlin Painter, really kind of an exquisite picture. So we see here an adolescent boy, precisely at the age when it is appropriate for him to be the object of sexual love from an older man. In his left hand, he holds a cock, a rooster, which is a traditional gift from an older lover to a beloved. And perhaps the hoop as well is a gift. And the fact that he's playing with it shows that he's still not an adult. You know, he still plays with toys. Other than that, we wouldn't be able to assign a specific narrative to this, except for the fact that other painters have also painted this scene. And with the boy, with the cock, with a hoop, in the same posture. But some of the other painters show him being pursued by Zeus. And the conclusion that you reach from this is that this boy is Ganymede. And in Homer's words, he says, Ganymedes was the loveliest born of the race of mortals, and therefore the gods caught him away to themselves to be Zeus's wine pourer for the sake of his beauty, so he might be among the immortals. I'm going to pause here because I've reached the end of this piece on pot painters. So let's see if there's some additional discussion before I move ahead.
One quick question: the color of the hair. I mean, there are two yellow colors here. So is that because the chemical or the firing or the whatever?
The yellow of the body is the clay.
Okay.
And the red of the hair is red pigment paint.
I don't know if anybody else had to say. My question was this found in Berlin? And I just Googled the thing, but the reason it's the Berlin Painter is because the pieces were in a museum in Berlin, had nothing to do. Is that?
That's exactly right.
true?
That's why I put that slide up in the very beginning where I said
Oh,
that one of the ways that painters are identified is by
I'm sorry, I
the
missed
city
first
in which
couple
their
minutes.
work is exhibited.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
And in general, when they show vases or, for example, this, they said originally is from wherever. But if the vase is found someplace else, let's say in the south of Italy, because they usually, the museums don't say that, right? Founded in blah, blah, blah.
Oh, no, they usually do.
Yeah.
I think they usually do. I mean, the focus, especially in the modern world, is on the artist. So when they find, for example, a work of Ezekias in Etruria, the fact that you can now add something to, it's like finding a Rembrandt in South America, right? The importance is that it's a Rembrandt and not that it's in South America. So I think that's kind of the attitude, but they will typically, most museums will indicate the find spot or the archaeological context if it's known. Okay, so moving ahead then, we've gone through the end of the 500s and into the early 400s, and if the changes in artistic style are any indicator, it would seem that something is going on in the society as a whole with people's way of thinking. So Robin Osborne thinks that another reflection of this change is the rapid spread of city-specific coinage in the end of the 5th century. And these are coins from Athens, from Argos and Chios. And basically the idea is that when coinage first appeared in Greece very rapidly, not only did it spread across Greece, but every city had to start making their own coinage. And that's what Osborne is pointing at. He's saying that the Greeks were very happy to use articles that were manufactured or grown from other cities. But they stopped at coinage because coinage had the name of the city on it and the symbol of the city. So he sees that as basically reflecting the identification of the Greeks with their city, as opposed to with their clan or their family, which is the older way that the Greeks thought of themselves. So instead of being, Demetrius, the son of Antigonus, now you're Demetrius of Athens. And he sees this reflected in the coinage. And then he points to 3 events that he says were really indicative of things that focused people's minds and made them think a different way. And some of them, have already been talked about in the history group, and some will be soon covered in the history group. But the first one he talks about is the consolidation of the Peloponnesian League by Sparta, right in this period. As I said, 525 to 475 is when all this stuff is happening. And so this idea that Sparta is the hegemon, the leader of mainland Greece, and is seen to have political and military dominance, this now becomes explicitly recognized in Greece. While in Athens, over the same period, they expel their tyrants. And the reformer Cleophrates, as Greg told us, introduces his democratic reforms. And this is the period when Athens switches from being a tyranny to a democracy. And we see the beginning or the rise of classical Athens. And while these things are happening, and something that really focuses the minds of the Greeks and makes them see themselves to some extent as Greeks, as opposed to Argives versus Eleans versus Spartans versus Achaeans, was the Persian expansion into areas that the Greeks considered their territory, which are the western coast of Asia Minor, Anatolia, which is Ionia, the cities of Miletus and the island of Samos and the island of Lesbos and Chios and Ephesus and places like that. And the Ionian states became subjects of the Persians. They lost their political autonomy, and they were very unhappy about this. And I think all of the Greeks on the mainland watched this, and I think it changed it made them think that the world is changing. The world was becoming smaller. They saw that they had an identity that they shared in common with other Greeks, in distinction to people outside the Greeks who were likely they were going to have to deal with in an adversarial way in the coming period. So, Osborne,
I'm sorry, I had one quick question back. You were showing the coins and saying, the identification with the city. The writing, like the earlier Sumerian coins that I've seen, or shekels or other things, don't have writing. To have writing on a coin assumes that, I don't know what the usage was, but that people could read that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. That's a great point, and it's absolutely right. I mean, that's also why I showed you that the pot painters, starting as early as the early 6th century, late 7th century, were able to write, and were tradesmen. So what I'm saying is that this is, first of all, a reflection of why the alphabet is so important, which is that the Sumerian coins in a culture that used cuneiform, only highly specialized people who studied for decades could read it. But with the alphabet, it became accessible to basically ordinary people. Now, I'm not saying that the majority of Greeks in the ancient world were literate, but I would imagine that probably the majority of people who lived in the large cities were literate, because we can see it trickled down as far as tradesmen who were able to write.
Paul,
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Please.
Just a question on coins. My understanding is that the oldest coin as such is King Alyattes of Lydia around 735 BC. The ancient Mesopotamians used precious metals by weight, and they also used barley and other things, but they didn't have any sort of standardized coin with an authenticating image, a certifying image or text on it. So it wasn't so the cuneiform era, if you're talking about the early cuneiform, there were no coins in this sense.
Absolutely true. However, it's also true that the writing system that they used, was not accessible to ordinary people at all. And in fact, I did talk about this when I made my presentation on Troy and the Hittites, that they found artifacts at Troy that had an alphabetic Luwian script on it, an early alphabetic Luwian script, as opposed to, so there was, this recognition that this was a more accessible form of writing. And at the same time, there are definitely stories of illiterate people in Athens. There's a famous story about someone who is about to be ostracized, and a farmer who wants to vote for the ostracism comes to him, not knowing who he was, and says, "I can't write. Will you help me write the name of the guy that I want to ostracize?" And it was that same guy, Agathis the Honest. And he said, "Okay, I'll show you how to," without ever saying who he was, he wrote his own name on the guy's pottery chunk to, so clearly there was illiteracy, but and I showed previously the cup of Nestor, and this comes from 720, 730 BC, where party goers had a cup where they had scratched like graffiti alphabetic inscriptions, 730 BC, in which showed some real literary sophistication, because they were making a joke about something in the Iliad, which itself was a joke made by Homer. So the spread of literacy and these people were probably traders, not lords. So the spread of literacy in metropolitan areas was considerable. Okay, so let's move ahead. Osborne, when he's talking about this change, starts using sculpture, statuary, to demonstrate the difference. So he starts with, this is what's called architectural sculpture. In other words, this is not a freestanding piece of sculpture. It's a relief, and it's put into, have you seen those bands that go around Greek temples? They're called metopes. They're kind of like a window, and people carve into this. So this is from a temple complex in Salamis, Sicily, and this is Temple Y in that complex. And the scene, excuse me, is Europa, is the woman, who is being abducted by Zeus in the form of a beautiful bull. You can look at his curls of his hair. He's just come from the beauty parlor. And the point that Osborne makes is that Zeus looks you full in the face. And what he's creating is he's giving the viewer an encounter with the divine. If you were in the archaic world and you went to a temple, you went there to have an encounter with the divine. You were going to give a votive offering, asking him for a favor, a transactional relationship, or some way, but you were looking to go there to encounter divinity. From the same complex, maybe 10 years later, and now you can see how this fits into the architecture of the temple, we see another scene. In this scene, we're seeing Perseus in the middle, decapitating the Gorgon Medusa, and Athena on his other side looks on. And all three of them look directly at the viewer, and Osborne suggests that that the viewer himself, who's looking at Medusa, Perseus can't look at Medusa because he'll be turned to stone. So Osborne suggests that the viewer, by looking at Medusa, and Perseus, by looking at the viewer, makes the viewer into the mirror. So the viewer is the mirror through which Perseus can see the head of Medusa and guide his stroke in order to decapitate her. Interesting interpretation. Now, this starts to change, as we said, as we get to this transitional period. This has been difficult to date, but it's in this, 520 to 480, 475 period. This is a reconstruction of what this building looked like originally. It's called the Syphilian Treasury at the Apollo's complex at Delphi, and all the Greek cities competed with each other to put fabulously wealthy displays in honor of the god at Delphi. And many of them were treasuries which held objects of great wealth, gold, silver, precious jewels, as well as war trophies that were being dedicated to the god. So this was the Syphilian treasury, and that was in this period. Siphonia was a very rich city. And on the east frieze, they have, this is a portion of it. The frieze as a whole, the part that's not shown off to the right, is the combat of Achilles with the hero Memnon, who's the daughter of the dawn. And in that duel, the decisive moment, they're both still alive, but the decisive moment is his hand. And what we're looking at here are the gods who support the Trojan side with their, hypothetical, because there's no clear way to identify them, but there's not even but these are the ones that scholars suspect they are, with a lot of doubt about Eos, or maybe it's Aphrodite. But in any event, they say Eos because she's the mother of Memnon. And the point that Osborne is making is that they're not interested in looking at the viewer. They're not interested in having an encounter with you. They are very much concerned with their own affairs. And this reflects the way the citizens of the polis were concerned with their own affairs. In other words, these are immortals involved in the political business of the immortal city. And they're essentially going to entreat Zeus to intervene and save Memnon from a death at the hands of Achilles.
Paul?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I get this right. Are you saying that in different city-states, the fact that on the reliefs, the gods are either looking at the viewer or not looking at the viewer reflects how that city-state viewed the gods?
No. I'm saying broader. I'm saying that's how people in that period of temple construction. In other words,
it's temporal, not geographic.
Yes, it's temporal, not geographic. Absolutely. So I'm talking about the archaic period, and I'm saying that the way that people conceived of art and the use that art was put to, and the way people conceived their relationship to the gods, they were there to have an encounter with the gods. And I showed it in Sicily, but you can show it all over the Grecian world. And then this is Osborne's thesis, that there's this change that occurs in this transitional period where we no longer see encounters. We no longer see the gods looking at us, in a way that's unrelated to the story, I might add. But they're busy with their own concerns. And here is from the same structure, also the Syphilian Treasury. This is the north side. And this is a well-known scene called Gigantomachy, which is the war between the gods and the giants. Very common scene on temples. I think it may have been depicted ultimately on one of the friezes in the Parthenon. And what's interesting here is that the giants are not giants. The giants are depicted as ordinary Greek hoplites. They're ordinary hoplite warriors. So this cosmic struggle between the Olympian gods and the older generation of giants is now transformed into this sort of interstate warfare that was absolutely common at this time, the war between polises. It's become political as opposed to theological, if you will. And similar, we can follow the sequence, temporal events of the development of Greek statuary. These are, and we talked about this a lot in the last time, Kouros statues, except for the center one. It's not a Kouros statue, but it's a kind of a similar statue, similar archaic period. It was a dedication on the Acropolis. The calf carrier, and by the way, this direct lineage of these figures from Egyptian art, where the pharaohs were depicted in the same postures, and well, we see a similar trajectory in these Kouroses that we see in the vase painting. So the trend is towards increasing naturalism, reaching a turning point at the end of the archaic period in the late 500s, with the on the right, the Aristodikos Kouros. We see that the arms are no longer attached to the hips. So in the archaic period, on its statuary had something that I call the archaic smile, or something that scholars call the archaic smile. You can see it pretty clearly on the Anavisos Kouros. It's there somewhat on the New York Kouros and the calf carrier. And that is tending to disappear. But at the same time, and these were used, by the way, as largely as either grave markers or as votive offerings in temples. But the point is that they're not portraits. They're idealized reflections of the viewer. You see the idealized young man in an idealized position. There's no attempt to be a specific person. And they seem to suggest movement, particularly the two ones on the right. But when you look at a rear view, look at the fact that their rear heel is firmly on the ground, showing that there's no shift in weight from one leg to the other. These statues are not moving. These statues are standing dead still. And we confirm this by looking at these lines. So I'm showing you the lines along the horizontal axis of the shoulders and the horizontal actions of the hips. They're completely parallel, which shows an absence of movement, and I'll come back to that. Now, here's what we see when we begin to get to the early classical style. The first classical style is called the severe style, and it's understood as a transitional style combining innovation with traditional elements. Dates are approximate. The scholars really don't know, somewhere, as I said, between 520 and 480. It seems to be the popular time for all sorts of stuff. So we see something called the enthroned goddess, but there's no reference that would allow us to identify which goddess it is. Artemis has been suggested, Aphrodite has been suggested. It's almost certainly not Athena because she doesn't have the aegis. You don't see the gorgon on her, between her breasts. And on the right is the figure of Apollo, which ultimately stood in the temple of Zeus at Olympia. And you can see the naturalism has gone beyond, and obviously the enthroned goddess is not moving, and we can't really tell that much about Apollo because of what's truncated, the way his legs are chopped off, or did not survive. Sure, you can see this statue was in chunks and was put together. And then we get to a real break, which is the sculptor Kritios in the early 5th century. So these statues depict people, a pair of men called Harmonius on the right and Aristogiton on the left. And they are known as the Tyrannosites. And they were the primary symbol of democracy in the entire ancient world. When you wanted to represent democracy, you showed an image of Harmonius and Aristogiton. And when you saw them, you knew that someone was trying to communicate the notion of democracy. Their great deed was in 514 BC, they assassinated the brother of the reigning tyrant of Athens. And they attempted to assassinate the tyrant as well, but they were not successful. And they were a reflection of the fact that the Athenians were sick and tired of being, were ready to rebel against this tyrannical family. These were the sons of Piscistratus, the first tyrant of Athens, who were ruling arbitrarily, and it was actually the specific incident was a sexual insult. They were lovers. Harmonius was the younger of them, and there was some sort of sexual insult that was given to them. But the real point was that the tyrants were acting with arrogance, what the Greeks called hubris, and felt they could do anything to anybody without any sort of, with complete impunity. And the Tyrannicide said, no, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill as many of you as I can. Harmonius was killed on the spot by the guards, but Aristogiton was captured, was tortured to death, and never broke, insulted the tyrant with his dying breath. there was an original statue of them. This is not the original, well, this is actually a copy of the statue by Kritios, but Kritios himself didn't make the original statue. The original statue was commissioned when the Athenian democracy started under Cleophrates, and it was the first monument that was paid for with public funds.
Oh, the original was in bronze, or the original was in marble?
The original was in bronze. So the original statue, I think the original, not the Kritios one, I think may have even been in wood. And it was looted by the Persians when they sacked the city of Athens in 480 BC, right before the Battle of Salamis. And it was taken back to Persia. So after the Greek victory, one of the first acts was to commission Kritios to replace them, which he did with these statues. Now, they were bronze originals, exactly as you said, and they have not survived. And these bronze copies were found at the villa of Hadrian in northern Italy. And the head of Aristogiton, the older man, was missing. This group was copied many times in antiquity. It was on coins. So basically, they found a head from another, much more poorly executed statue, and they took the head of Aristogiton from that statue and put it on this one, just so he'd have something. But that's not the way that Cleophrates did it. And all these, the problem, by the way, with looking at Greek art is because so much of the vast majority of the things that you see are copies, the quality of the copies widely varies, and you just don't know. There's no way of knowing exactly how good the original were, though it's quite reasonable to assume that they're better than the best copy.
Was it ever recovered? I mean, during the Alexander's time?
Actually, interestingly, Alexander the Great found it at Susa and recovered it.
But and what happened to the original?
I was taken back to Greece. I don't. He sent it back to Greece. I don't know what happened to it after that. So artistically, let's talk about that for a minute. And we see that all of a sudden, there's no question about the fact that these images are in motion. And that, in a nutshell, is the great innovation of the classical period. The heels of the figures are not on the ground. Their postures are extremely innovative with diagonal lines. Their arms are, by the way, you can see that Harmonius has two swords, one in each hand, that are broken off. You can only see the hilt. And Aristogiton has a sword, and they're thrusting right into the space with this bold thrust, very innovative. And this is the revolution in Greek art. Another work by Kritios is known as the Kritios Boy, found in the rubble on the Acropolis. They found the body first and the head 10 years later, and it took another 10 years for them to figure out that they belonged together. And then maybe more than that to figure out that it was by Kritios. So interesting thing about this is that it's very much like the Koros statue. And in its basic parameters, it conforms to the traditions and the conventions of the Koros statue, but at the same time, it stands apart from the traditional Koros. Firstly, because it shows real motion. The beginning of what is known as the Contrapposto. I don't want to talk about that now. Just going to mention the name, and we'll talk about it later in a few minutes. But so that's the first thing, is that we see real motion. It's also more difficult. Once again, we have to assume what his legs were doing because we can't see. And the second aspect of this, is that it's more portrait-like. If we look at the boy's hips and we see that they're in motion, there's a twist that makes him into an actor, right? He's active. He's not a passive mirror for the spectator. His face is a little fleshy. It looks more like an individual face, not a completely idealized face. So it's seen as part of this important early transition, the beginning of the severe classical style. And now we're really into it, right? This is the early classical style, severe style, and its high point. This figure is known as the Charioteer of Delphi. It's an original bronze surviving from antiquity. There are very few of them, and this is one of them. It's in the Museum at Delphi. And if you look at the one on the right, you can see he's got some of the reins in his hands, and so he's driving his chariot, but he's not racing because he's not crouched over. There's not high speed going on in his chariot. So the speculation by scholars is that he's taking a victory lap. Now he's driving his chariot, but he's doing it slowly. Professor Marinopoulos points out that the statue is naturalistic, but the pose is still rigid. But his expression is introverted, maybe thoughtful, musing. It's no longer this, there is a kind of blankness to it, but it's a more human image that you would associate with the archaic statues. Follow that with this. This is known as the god from Artemisia. And you can see this at the Archaeological Museum in Athens. It's big, it's life size, and it's very, very impressive in real life. I mean, it blows you away. It represents a very powerful god, but we don't know which god. And the identification of which god it is will depend on what you think is in his right hand. So if he's tossing a lightning bolt, then this is Zeus. But if he's got his trident in his right hand, it's Poseidon. But either way, it's a fabulously naturalistic, but still idealized image. Note that even though his arms are in motion, their muscles are not tensed. It's not as if he's exerting any effort to do his throw. It's more almost like he's a dancer posing than like he's actually involved in the effort of throwing something that requires the exertion of strength. And we see a real change here. And now we're really into the classical period. So this is Myron. Myron was a student of Kritios, who we saw before with the Tyrannosites and the Kritios Boy. And this is one of the most famous images from all of antiquity. The discus thrower, or in Greek, the diskoboulos, sometimes used just as a symbol to represent all of Greek culture as a whole. Myron worked exclusively in bronze, and the original has not survived. Once again, there's many copies of this which have differences, particularly in the expression of the face and exactly the way the face is focused. But it's interesting that he's kind of the naturalism of the body. This statue is celebrated for capturing a moment in time. If you look at the exertion of the muscles and the smoothness, we know exactly what's happening. We know exactly what's happening at the time. But at the same time, Myronopoulos says it's still transitional. These are, yeah.
I'm sorry, who is commissioning these at this stage of the game?
I think for most of them, we don't know. There are some that we do know, and I'll mention it where we do know.
Okay.
But for these that I've shown, the charioteer, the god, I mean, let me say the god from Artemisium was found in the water off the city of Artemisia, which is on the coast of Thessaly, you know, at the point between where Thessaly meets the northern tip of Euboea. So, you know, it was in the water. It's never been, you know, a lot of these objects of art were described by ancient authors, Strabo and Pausanias, who were tourists, and there were catalogs of ancient art. And I don't think this was listed.
Okay, so I'm sort of assuming that these now moved out of the private realm into the public realm. They were
hard to say, but certainly for it's hard to say. You know, were they some of, we know that the Tyrannosites were commissioned by a city. We know that cities would identify with specific gods as representing their political identity. So certainly they could be commissioning a statue, or a statue could be commissioned to, you know, for any number of reasons, but we don't have hard information on many of these.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Paul, if I could put this into a bit of a context and religious, you mentioned earlier, I thought it was interesting that some of the gods are depicted facing the viewer and hence sort of a contact with the divine, whether others are just depicted more narratively. Here, gods are symbols of the city. I guess I would think maybe one can trace an evolution, as I understand it, from a genuine religious sense of religion and theology to a much more mythological and legendary, or even purely symbolic. That is, I think by Plato and Aristotle, the philosophers didn't really believe that the gods were active in the world, and even going back to Thales and Anaximander, but they still loved, they still liked the stories and the images of the ancient gods. Can you see that sort of movement from
Absolutely.
a more religion to a legend to folk legend?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, you know, we're going to see, and people have talked about this, that in this high classical period in Greece, you have what's scholars have called the sophistic revolution. It's, you know, the difference between Herodotus and Thucydides, where Herodotus tells you fabulously entertaining tales where the gods intervene and there are all sorts of things happening that couldn't possibly happen in the real world. Then just one generation later, Thucydides writes a work of realpolitik, which could be, you know, could be written by Henry Kissinger, and is studied today as the foundational work in rational history. So this was, you're absolutely right. This was the transition that was happening in all of Greek society. And in fact, if we even go a little further, you know, just look at it in a slightly different context, in the Hellenistic world, the writings of Philo of Alexandria. Philo was a very well-educated Jew who moved in the highest aristocratic circles, hobnobbed with the highest Greek aristocrats in Alexandria, and he has to write a whole series of articles that are basically apologies, where the Greeks are accusing the Jews of being idolaters because they talk about things like the hand of God, right? There are things that anthropomorphize God in the Bible. So the assumption is that the Greeks themselves are so far past this, right? The Greeks have so evolved their thinking about the divine and the idea of the soul and the university of the gods, and Zeus has become a symbol of universal godhood, as referred to this guy that chases women and you know, and is fooled and all this sort of stuff. In the same way that, you know, in later years you see that Bible stories become turned into allegories rather than believed directly or literally. So I think that, you know, it's an indication of the increasing sophistication philosophically of the society. Absolutely right. So the Riaci warriors, salvaged from an ancient shipwreck near the Italian town of Riaci, placed in the same maybe 470 period. Osborne suggests that they were part of a larger monument, perhaps commemorating the Greek victory in the Persian Wars. If you notice, both figures, they're found next to each other. They're very similar, but still distinct. Their left arms are horizontal, which shows, which means that they were holding hoplite shields, and you can kind of see the little plane. See if I can get a. Well, I don't have a pointer. Does my cursor appear? Probably not. But you can see something on a figure A near his elbow, and you see something in around similarly around the forearm of figure B. These are the straps of their shield.
Yeah, we can see your pointer.
Oh, okay. So you see that around there. So they were holding shields. And warrior A originally wore a diadem and a wreath, and warrior B wore a helmet tilted back on his head, like we often see in depictions of Pericles. There's been a lot of scholarly ink spilled on comparing the two of those. A is more physically fit. He's got a sharp gaze that denotes anger. B's gaze is less reactive, and his stance is more settled and shows a reluctance to move. A is more sexually attractive to women, while B is more sexually attractive to men. Not sure why. And Osborne writes, whoever they stood for, these statues represented to the viewer real men, so instilled with life that the viewer's reactions come close to the reactions they might experience when they see live men of similar appearance. And we're getting close to the climax now. Is it okay? I mean, I know I'm a half hour over, but can I keep going? And maybe we can wrap this up in another 10 minutes. Everybody good with that?
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep, very good.
Okay, so next image. Oops. This is the Doryphoros, the spear carrier by Polykletos. This is one of the great masterpieces in all of Western art. The Doryphoros, tremendously influential. Doryphoros means spear carrier, and he was holding a spear in his left hand. You see he was carrying that loosely. It was kind of resting on his left shoulder. The original was in bronze. And Osborne writes that much of the sensitivity of the original was lost when this marble copy was made. I find that, almost hard to even conceptualize, because this marble statue is so beautiful and absolutely breathtaking. And before I break it apart, just give people just a chance to take it in and admire it. It comes about a decade after the Riaci warriors. And Osborne describes this as the classic statue of a man. Polykletos was famous for a doctrine that there was a single fixed set of ideal proportions for the representation of the human body. And he wrote a book on it called the Canon, C-A-N-O-N. And for this reason, the Doryphoros itself is sometimes referred to as the Canon. Professor Mylanopoulos calls this the extreme idealization of the human body and the archetype of the stance known as the Contrapposto. So what is Contrapposto? It's an Italian term from the Renaissance, being applied back here as Greeks are the inventors of the Contrapposto, and it means opposite or opposite place in Italian. And Professor Mylanopoulos describes the Contrapposto as follows. The right leg is weight-bearing or tensed, while the left leg is relaxed and makes contact with the ground with its toes only. The waist defines the line that extends downward from the tensed leg to the relaxed leg. The shoulders define the line with a slope that is opposite to the line defined by the waist, and the head is turned towards the tensed right leg. The right arm hangs loosely on the tensed side, while the left arm is held horizontally supporting the spear next to the relaxed side. So in sum, the tensed and relaxed arms are opposite to the tensed and relaxed legs, and the slope of the shoulders is opposite from the slope of the hips, hence the name Contrapposto, or opposite. And just to give some slight sense of how influential this was, this is a statue of the Emperor Augustus, first emperor of the Roman Empire. It's clearly modeled on the Doryphorus in every way. And this statue, with copies of this were made, and there were hundreds of these distributed around the Roman Empire. This is the symbol in many ways of the Roman Empire. And it's the model clearly is Polycletus. We have one more sculptor to cover. And
quick question.
Yes, sure.
This was done originally in marble?
No, the Doryphorus was in bronze.
Interesting.
Yes, and as they said, you know, it looks to me like a great copy in marble, but Osborne says that it lost a lot. And if we look at the Riachi warriors, and we look at the god from Artemisian and the charioteer, we can see how much more detail they got in there, and naturalism they achieved in the bronzes. I mean, the bronze was easier to work than marble because the bronze was a casting method where the original figure was made with with basically an outer layer of wax or clay, and then the bronze is molded on it. They don't actually have to hammer the metal or anything like that. They're working in a very soft material. But when they work in marble, you're sitting there with a hammer and a chisel. So you have much more ability to be for nuance and subtlety when you're working in the bronze statue.
Got it. And then would you say Michelangelo's David was also kind of modeled on this? Absolutely. Form factor?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No modern sculptor, well, no sculptor of the Renaissance. And I mean, in fact, there's a work of Michelangelo, which there's a scholarly argument whether it's really by Michelangelo or whether it's from 200 BC, which is the Lycaon, where the man and his sons are being surrounded by serpents because they're trying to warn the Trojans not to take the Trojan horse. So I'm saying that Michelangelo's work is so similar to the Greeks that there's an argument whether something was a Michelangelo or whether it was by a Greek from 2,000 years earlier or 1,500 years earlier.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Paul, how could Professor Osborne say that the marble copy lost some features?
Maybe he's basing that on looking at the other bronzes.
I see.
And comparing the bronzes to marble copies. That's really the only way that I could see that he could possibly know it. I mean, we do have, we have written descriptions of these, as I said, but they couldn't express something like that. So that's the only way he could possibly be surmising that.
Yeah.
Short of him having a time machine. So the end, the last that we're going to cover as we reach this high classical period is Phidias, sculptor Phidias. And this is a model of Athena Parthenos, which was the centerpiece, the cult image of the Parthenon in Athens. he was widely considered to be the greatest sculptor of the ancient world. And he was revered for capturing the essence of divine being, which he did in the form of statues on a colossal scale. So as I said, this Athena Parthenos, you see her name is linked with the Parthenon, which by the way, comes from the word virgin. Athena was the virgin goddess. And so this was the centerpiece of that. The original statue stood 37 feet tall. It was made from gold and ivory, which is called, I forgot actually. It's like a four-syllable word, elephantine or something like that. So this is a Roman era reproduction, considered to be the most faithful to the original. I don't know the scale, but it's certainly not anything approaching the scale of Phidias. Phidias was a close friend and associate of Pericles, and the statue was erected when Athens was at the very height of her imperial power. It was paid for by the tribute that Athens extracted from her former allies in the Delian League, and it depicts the goddess after victory in battle. She wears Zeus's aegis, as you can see, with the head of the Gorgon. In her right hand, she holds winged victory, the goddess Nike. In her left hand, she supports her hoplite shield. Just to give you a sense of the sheer scale and magnificence of this, look at this. The person standing there is the sculptor. This is a full-size replica in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville calls itself the Athens of the South. And they commissioned this sculptor to make a full-size replica of Athena Parthenos. But this wasn't the end. Athena Parthenos made such a tremendous impression on the rest of the Greeks. And the citizens of the city of Elis, Elis was the city-state in which the Olympia was found. Olympia was the site of the Olympic Games, one of the most ancient and holy places in all of Greece, a place from which the Greeks basically traced their national identity. And they determined that this holy site should not be outdone by a single city, Athens. And they commissioned, therefore, the construction of the great temple of Zeus. And they hired Phidias to come from Athens and create a workshop in Olympia and build a statue of the god. Phidias worked on it for 13 years, and the result was one of the 7 wonders of the world. The original was more than 30 feet tall, made from gold and ivory panels over a wooden frame. Base was ornamented with ebony, ivory, gold, and precious stones. Zeus holds his scepter in his left hand. It's surmounted by an eagle in the original, according to the descriptions. And like Athena Parthenos, he holds a statue of Nike in his right. The actual appearance of the statue is known only from ancient descriptions and from the representations on coins. But check this out. As impressed as we may be from the replica, pardon me?
Was it the wonder of the world?
This is a wonder of the world.
One of those 7?
This is one of the 7 wonders of the world, exactly.
The Zeus of
and the thing that
Olympia.
makes
that's right.
the thing that you need to conceptualize is that this whole thing was conceived. The statue and the temple were conceived as an integrated whole. And so the statue was designed to sit as the focus of the converging lines of perspective of the architectural lines of the columns and the horizontals. And we can see the effect that it has. This is actually an image from a video game. But it does somehow kind of convey the overpowering grandeur of this fabulous creation. When Phidias and this is a legend, when Phidias was asked what inspired him, he answered that the Zeus that he portrayed is based on the Iliad, Book 1, verse 528 to 530, which says, "And he spoke, the son of Kronos, and nodded his head with the dark brows, and the immortally anointed hair of the great god swept from his divine head, and all Olympus was shaken." And that's it, everybody. Thank you for your attention.
One quick point is that the eagle for Zeus is the core emblem of the United States.
And many others too, you know.
Sure,
You know, the England was the eagle was on the Romanovs and the Habsburgs, and
exactly.
sometimes with multiple heads.
Unbelievable.
And the beautiful drapery on that Athena, does that not remind you of our Statue of Liberty? Nothing.
Yes.
Comes
And in fact, the French who created the Statue of Liberty saw themselves as neoclassicists.
Exactly.
Right? Saw themselves as reproducing that tradition. Saw themselves as the inheritors of Rome.
Yep, especially in the Napoleon of the Third. That was a very neoclassical period.
I mean, there are portraits of Napoleon dressed as Augustus.
Exactly.
Hey, Paul, quick question. This is a question that I saw pop up that I thought was really kind of interesting. Is someone had asked whether the black figure, red figure styles or techniques are replicated today, or are they lost to history?
Oh yeah,
they can be replicated today, but typically they're not done because they're a pain in the ass.
Oh, okay. The materials still exist, Paul.
Well, it's just clay.
Okay.
Right? It's clay taken from from.
But they would
Attica.
know how to do it. They would know.
Yeah, and at least now we can write down the chemical reactions of what happens, with when there's oxygen and see it's the way the impurities in the clay combine with oxygen or absence of oxygen.
Because sometimes these methods are gone. With some things they don't know.
Yes,
that's interesting.
What they call is the lost wax method for casting the bronzes is gone.
That's very interesting.
But let me say that I own an image, and I own a replica of the Euphronius crater, that huge thing, which I bought in Athens. There's a all around the Acropolis there are these very high-end souvenir shops, somewhere between souvenir shops and art dealers, and in the middle they had this huge crater, and it was half finished, and half of it was just plain clay, and the other side was painted, and it was so beautiful. And this was before I had studied anything about Greek art. I didn't know anything about it. I was just overwhelmed by it, and I bought it. And it took, they had to crate it up in this huge crate so it could arrive in the United States. I had to go to the port of Newark to get it. And it's been sitting in my house for 30 years. And when I look at it now, I see that the paint is rubbing off. On the original vases, the paint couldn't rub off because it wasn't paint. But it's a lot easier to paint than to take a huge thing like that and go through
and fire it. How could they fire it?
Not just firing it, but have the control over the firing process.
Exactly.
Oxygen and take oxygen out.
Well, imagine how many they broke and destroyed before they got the one they wanted.
Well, imagine how long it took them. Well, imagine how long it took ancient man to figure out how to get copper out of ore, or how to make bronze. Right? These were considered magical because they didn't know anything about chemistry. They didn't know what atoms were, even though there was a Greek who described
trial and error. You're talking about
trial and error and observation. And look, the bottom line here is that human beings now are no smarter than human beings were 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Right?
So true. So true.
We have the same characteristics of being resilient, of being observant, right? I believe whenever I see something from the ancient world that looks silly in the light of today, that's a reflection on our lack of understanding and not on the silliness of the people who did it.
Oh, I have a question and comment somewhat in the same light. The Athena Parthenos, the whole, at least what I see online is that the Parthenon was completed in 15 years. That means I assume that the statue, I just don't understand how literally you can move enough materials into that space just from the physics. You have to lift this to a top of a hill.
Well, okay, so how was the statue built?
Well, how was it built? And in 15 years to not only do
to
that,
talk about the statue itself.
Yeah,
the statue has a wooden frame. Both the Athena and the Zeus have a wooden frame, and then it's essentially assembled out of plates of gold and ivory. So you can, kind of easily imagine how that could be done. As for the Parthenon itself, okay, well, 15 years is, it's a long time, but it's a lot longer than it took the Egyptians to build the pyramids, which is why the pyramids are so amazing. So that, yeah, they had to lug marble, big blocks, and they had to get it up the Acropolis. They had 15 years to do it. They had cranes, and they had a huge amount of money to use to pay people to do it and to hire. They hired like a small army of sculptors. So if you look at the famous Parthenon sculptures, the friezes and the pedimentally, the Elgin marbles, they're of widely different quality because you can't get, there's just so many master sculptors available to you, and they had more sculpture that they needed to create than they could find master sculptors. So they had a lot of money. They were extremely rich. They had, they had subjects. This was the height of their empire, and that's how they spent their money.
Are there any records in the literature about the actual process and the organization of building? I mean, it's a incredible rebuilding the whole Acropolis in a few years. So are there any kind of records of how that was done and organized? Or?
I don't know anything about that in detail. I mean, there's a lot of, like, once again, when I read for Greg's presentation on Pericles, when I read Plutarch, he talks a lot about the the rebuilding of the Acropolis and the building of the Parthenon, particularly because Pericles was attacked and accused of corruption, and there was a scandal of Pericles and Phidias, was he skimming money off the top? And, so there's a lot of information on that. I don't really know what's in a lot of the ancient authors, but, there are so many little drabs and pieces that the great scholars study coming from. The problem is that so many of them are written hundreds of years after the fact. So what do they actually know? What were their sources? Did they actually have a good source? We don't know. That's one reason that ancient history to me is so fascinating, is because very frequently you just have to look for plausibility. You can't look for definitive proof because it doesn't exist. So what you can do is you have to take the clues that you find and put it together and try to construct a plausible narrative. And then when new clues come in that destroy your existing narrative, you come up with a new narrative, exactly like, it's like science, it's like what happened to Newtonian physics when Albert Einstein came along. You have to revise your theory.
All right, guys.
Remember, Pericles was offering to pay for this out of his own funds, and he was accused of corruption.
Yeah, well, he couldn't have paid for this out of his own funds.
Well, he suggested, I don't think he meant it, but everybody is like, no, it's okay. Everybody was impressed.
I want to thank Paul for really, 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 many times really incredible presentation. And we all enjoyed it so much that, people stayed along, so far right now, the 15, 14 people left. and they want to hear even bits and pieces of what Paul has to say.
Let me just say, I want to thank everybody here for letting me do this, because this was such a labor of love. I had such a great time. I spent so many hours on this, so many of these pictures that I showed, they're retouched, I did all sorts of crazy obsessive stuff. And so thank you for giving me an outlet for my energy. I appreciate that.
Excuse me, could I ask a question? Excuse me, could I ask a question?
Please.
Olga, go
Okay. More than 5 years ago, I read that one scholar suggested that in these bronze Greek statues, so much of fine details that maybe the casts were done from real people. Do you think it's possible?
No, it's not. It's not, because in order to make a bronze cast, you have to have molten bronze, and you can't make a statue from real people with liquid metal.
No, they have some kind of, yes, I understand this, but they have some kind of techniques. First, they do it from something else, and then.
Well, let me just say it's a great question, but first of all, the scale. Many of these things are at non-human scales. They're either bigger or they're small, so that makes it obvious. And the other point is that, and this is one of the things I was stressing, that even with most of the high class, even with the Doryphorus, the images are idealized. They're not real people, right? They're ideal images. They're clearly not real people. They're intended not to be real people. They're intended to be an image of perfection, right? They're intended not to show emotion. They're supposed to show serenity, a godlike sense of beauty and serenity. So I would consider that to be unlikely.
Paul, yeah, just a comment. I read some years ago about the modern classical, that is the 19th century nude, the body. And there, a lot of the art critics, where we have a lot of text on it, they emphasize this idealization. And they said, no, this is not a real person. Well, we're taking the hand from one and we're idealizing it, and we take the face from something else, we take the arms from something else. So they were, yes, it was very specifically not a real person. It was an idealized person. So that's a modern concept as well. And maybe they even got that from the Greeks. There was a bit of a neoclassical.
If you want to have some fun, go to Google and Google Polycletes canon. So let me, Polycleitos canon, CONON. And you will find the most crazy detail of the mathematical proportions, and scholars, and the numbers don't work out right. So the scholars, they showed one scholar who shows this fine diagram of the proportion of the bones in your fingers, and saying these were what Polycletes was really using when he divined, so, but that sense. So these were studied, right? These were not, they were designed not to be real. And as I say, the last stage of Greek art is the Hellenistic period, and most of it's kind of changed, I think, in the last 20 years. And we'll talk about this. We're going to cover the Hellenistic period coming up. Looks like it may be a while before we get there. But the Hellenistic period for a very long time was thought to be degenerate, right? Most of you, many of you may have heard this. The Greeks were admirable in the classical period of Athens when they did things like the Doryphoros, and the Hellenistic area was a degeneration when they were, corrupt and whatever it is, luxuriated and so forth. But when you look at that Hellenistic art, it seems so much more human. So much in a modern piece, it would be so much more valued because you're seeing human beings in agony or in other, expressions of intense emotion. So I don't agree that there's a degeneration in Hellenistic art, but that's like the primary difference of, that. So this classical period is still highly idealized, but the Greeks are going to continue. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that as they continue politically, the polis ceases to become important, and the political power of individual people disappears as the society becomes ruled by kings, by Alexander and by his successor, right? And so people became more concerned with their domestic issues and their private life. There really was a private life in a sense that there may not have been in the high classical period. So it's a more modern feeling, right? It's than the kind of activist world of the classical period, right? I mean, the classical period, imagine a world in which, you'd go to the ecclesia once a year and they would draw lots. And you say, oh, you're the district attorney. Oh, you're the prime minister because your name came up by random. That was a whole different idea of what, life was like.
Yeah, Paul, again, thank you. Again, I think I want to continue on this art exhibition piece. And one of the few things we're going to do in the, as I've said, I've moved up the fall of Sparta to the 1/9, January 9th. And we're going to do something new. It's a tour of different museums since people can't travel. First one is going to be the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, which I happened to go last year. And particularly, I want to focus on the tomb of Alexander the Great, which actually wasn't his tomb, but it says Tomb of Alexander the Great to draw tickets, I guess, into the museum. But I'll present the pictures I took, and we'll talk about different pieces and kind of take you through different areas of a museum. Again,
what? I think it's called Alexander the Great because the battle is the famous battle of Alexander was depicted on that tomb. Yeah.
So just to go through on our ancient part through a schedule, we have all of Sparta 1/9, Philip 1/23, Alexander. And I already loaded the schedule in on our modern or more outside of ancient side. We're going to talk about Zionism on 12/20, and Aaron is going to present USA versus USSR on 1/3. And Aaron, let me know if it's too close to the new year.
No, that's fine. I'm actually trying to get someone also potentially as a speaker. He's
not Gorbachev by any chance, no?
No. He's best friends with my my old sergeant major. He's written a bunch of books and stuff, so he's a pretty cool guy. And if I can get him, then we might switch this around a little bit. So I'll put in here the book or one of the books he's written. So and then if I can get him in time, if not, maybe it's later for him, and then I just still do this, and we can kind of sneak him in at some other point.
And then you also have Hanseatic League. I don't know if you want somebody with it. If you want, I can give it to you somebody so that because it's
no, I mean I've been working on that one. I mean that's my
baby.
That's become my new last year or two, 3 maybe Mongol fetish is the Hanseatic League.
Nice.
Sort of,
I love it. And then in between we have Bushido, but I can't get a hold of Adrian, so we might have to move that one. We'll see. I have to speak to him. I changed an ancient text with Paul. We are not going to do Xenophon Anabasis on 12/23. We'll move it to 1/27. And on 12/23, since I moved my Josephus Flavius Jewish War, please, you have a chance at least read, 1 or 2 chapters. Really interesting read. I mean, I've read it. It was really good, and I spoke to Greg about it. Greg read some of the stuff, and it talks a little bit about Hellenization of Jews, and would be interesting stuff.
And all this story about Herod, how he came to power, and the Hasmonean dynasty, Herodian dynasty, just prior to the uprising, eventually where he took place, where took part. Yeah. So a lot of interesting stuff like that.
Yeah, I actually was surprised how interesting it was. Then this Wednesday we're doing Jonathan that did Teutonic Knights. He's our famous reincarnator. Actually studied to be an opera singer, and somehow knows a lot about medieval ventures. He's gonna do King John on brother of Richard the Lionheart. So please join us on 12:30. I'm gonna do Idi Amin if you guys are interested. Particularly, I will also do a part where Mossad came in and kind of took the hostages off his hands, and he was really dumbfounded. So that would be an interesting part. I'll talk a little bit about Mossad with that as well, because it's part of this whole thing. Then on the our kind of modern pieces that we do on Thursdays, we already did the foreign exchange. We're going to do future of electronic vehicle, Tesla, NIO, Xpeng, Li. Those are the four major ones. There's other ones like Nikola and Workhorse, and we're going to talk about why are they future of the motor vehicle industry. And obviously we'll get in a little bit more detail what differs those four companies from the other ones. And that's the closest ones December ones I can think of. And if you guys have any additions, I've added actually an interesting piece. We're going to do Arab Spring, and Richard just texted me back. He wants to do a series of Arab Spring. So it's a series of Arab revolts starting with Tunis, working its way to Egypt, and Syria and stuff like that. So there would be a series of Arab Spring revolts or civil wars, however you want to call it. And then we'll probably do Orange Revolution with Ukraine, and at some point we'll see. And then if I'm looking for presenters for Napoleon and Rommel, if anybody wants to step up, and I'm looking for presenters for a history of ancient weapons. If anybody wants to step up as well. That's basically it. And again, Paul, this was amazing. Thank you so much. And it was definitely a lot of love put into it. And I'll see you guys next Sunday. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Wednesday. Sorry, Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday. Three next week. So, all right.
All right. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thanks a lot.
Fantastic.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul.
Right.
Excellent. Terrific work.
Yeah, terrific work. Absolutely.
Ralph.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Bye.
Bye.